So we're going to sit to study, sweat, and stretch. So we'll do 30 minutes reading, 30 minutes meditation, 30 minutes martial arts, and 30 minutes yoga. Normally there's a workout, but we're going to cut it short today.
Rate, subscribe, and leave us a review there. You can also go to Spotify to leave us a review there too. It really helps us get in front of more eyes and into more ears. We don't have a marketing budget or anything like that for Upstream, so we really do rely on listeners like you to help grow our audience and spread the word. And also, Upstream is a labor of love. It's really important for us to keep our bi-weekly conversation series and quarterly documentaries free of charge and accessible to anyone who's interested. But it all takes a lot of time and resources. If you can, if you're in a place where you can afford to do so, and if it's important for you to keep this content free and sustainable, please consider going to upstreampodcast.org/support to make a one-time or recurring monthly donation. Thank you.
Buddhism is interested in the inward liberation of the human mind from sort of self-imposed limitations and delusions and the incessant fear-produced need to cling on to things that we like and to run away from things that hurt us. And of course, Marxism, in simplest terms, wants to seek humanity from dividing us up into classes. There should be, ultimately, no poor people and super rich people. There should not be a world in which we have billionaires that own everything and don't have to work, who live exclusively off the toil of other human beings, while huge masses of people suffer, live lives of extreme precarity, are brutally exploited for the billionaires' classes and the owning classes' profits, and who live half lives, deformed lives, so that the richest among us can live lives of utter luxury and opulence and unknown comfort.
You are listening
To Upstream.
Upstream. Upstream.
Upstream, a podcast of documentaries and conversations that invites you to unlearn everything you thought you knew about economics. I'm Robert Ring.
And I'm Dylan Duncan.
When you think about the philosophies and practices of Buddhism and Marxism, you might not immediately think that they have much in common, but you might be surprised at how much overlap and complementary resonance there actually is between these two rich and influential traditions. In this conversation, we brought on Brett O'Shea, a Buddhist practitioner and Marxist political educator based out of Omaha, Nebraska. Brett is the host of the podcast Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of the podcasts Red Menace, Guerrilla History, and most recently, Shoeless in South Dakota. You might remember Brett when he was on the show about a year ago to talk about revolutionary leftist theory. In this conversation, we explore how both Buddhism and Marxism offer helpful pathways to liberation and provide a spot-on analysis of the root causes of suffering. We also explore some of the potential tensions between Buddhism and Marxism, as well as what each tradition can learn from the other. And we end with a powerful invitation for all of us to embark on the path of the Bodhisattva revolution, to both end the internal and structural causes and conditions of suffering, and to bring forth the systemic changes necessary for the transition to a communist society based on liberation, equity, and justice for all. This interview was inspired by an episode of Revolutionary Left Radio titled Dialectics and Liberation, Insights from Buddhism and Marxism, where Brett read a speech he gave at Arizona State University on the topic of dialectical materialism, Buddhism, and Marxism. Definitely check that episode out when you're done listening to this. It's a great complement to this conversation. And now, here's Della in conversation with Brett O'Shea.
Well, Brett, welcome. So happy to have you on for these
maybe let's start with an introduction. If you could introduce yourself, particularly in relation to the two topics of our conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm a genuine fan of Upstream, not only the podcast, but your presence on social media as well. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be able to collaborate and engage with your work in particular. So thank you so much for having me on. For those that don't know, my name is Brett O'Shea. I host Rev Left Radio and co-host Guerrilla History and Red Menace, all three of which are basically Marxist left-wing political shows with different emphasis, different forms of analysis, different co-hosts, etc., sort of addressing the tradition of Marxism from kind of three distinct angles. Red Menace is more about theory, Guerrilla History more about history, and Rev Left is like a casting a wide net, touching on whatever I find interesting, trying to bring more people into the left, etc. In relation to the two topics of Buddhism and Marxism, I would honestly say that they are like the core constitutive ideological approaches that really are the pillars of my worldview. Buddhism, I got into Buddhism as a late teen after a pretty intense mental health crisis and subsequent existential crises where I was just really struggling with the big issues of life. Who am I? What is this life about? What is the meaning of life? What happens when we die? And those questions were really haunting me. And so I went on, as many people do, a search to try to find something that can begin to address those issues at the level I wanted them addressed at. And I had just through actually like friends and acquaintances and random life events gotten into and introduced to the basics of Buddhism and became very, very interested in it in my late teens and early 20s. And that's how I got into that. And then Marxism, it really arose just from, if Buddhism is me concerned with the inner world, my own suffering, my own existence, Marxism was the highest and best articulation of a politic that fit with my life experiences and my personal values. And so it was really my late teens, early 20s that these things were completely separate, but I was into them, and diving deeper and deeper, spent my entire 20s not becoming, I don't ever say I'm an expert on anything, but just as somebody genuinely interested, learning and wanting to teach others what I've learned, got into Buddhism and Marxism separately, and through my engagement with both, as my understanding of both traditions deepened, I started to see some interesting ways in which they dovetail, or some interesting connections in their overall worldviews that I had always, or since then, was really interested in, and then I got this wonderful opportunity to write an essay and give a speech at ASU combining these two topics. I was explicitly asked by them, could you do something where you talk about Buddhism and Marxism and their relatedness? And I was like, this is what I've been preparing, my intellectual life to do. And so it was a nice little occurrence. And so I wrote out my thoughts that I had, been developing for years, and my interest in both traditions, wrote those out in my episode on Rev Left called Dialectics and Liberation. If anybody's interested, I'll certainly be drawing heavily from that. But I've also had many more discussions on Rev Left with people in religious and spiritual communities, because I think it's an important element that sometimes gets completely dismissed out of hand by Marxists to our detriment. And so I'm sure we'll get into some of that later. But that's kind of who I am and how I came to be interested in these two beautiful traditions.
Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, it was Robert told me to listen to Rev Left, particularly because I was wondering about what dialectics was, dialectical materialism. And he was like, okay, well, here's a primer from Rev Left Radio. And I was listening, and it was that moment when I was listening when I was like, wait, this sounds so much like Buddhism, like the codependent arising of all things. And so I too had this kind of like, wait, this feels very familiar. So I really appreciate the way that you're linking the two and distinguishing, and also what can the two learn from each other. It's a great prompt, great question. So let's dive in first to the synergies or connections. So what do you see as the overlaps or the synergies, the connections between Buddhism and Marxism?
Yeah, I think they're very different traditions arising out of very different cultures in very different time periods of human evolution. So, and historically, there's been some conflict between them. You can think about Zen Buddhist kamikaze pilots in World War II, the Chinese communists versus Tibet, and that whole situation. So it's like not only on the face of them they're so different, but even just in recent history they seem to be at odds. So it's sort of counterintuitive for many people to think of these two things as having a relationship, but I think they have several relationships, but the core of their synergy, the core of their overlap is, in my estimation, their dialectical worldviews. So for those that don't know, of course, this is a very big topic, and I'm not going to be able to fully flesh out the entirety of dialectical materialism here, but I have many episodes on Rev Left and Red Venice walking people through the complexities of dialectical materialism, historical materialism, for those that really want to dive deep into it. And of course, in my Dialectics and Liberation speech, I also give a pretty good primer, I think, on what dialectical materialism is. And I use evolution via natural selection to sort of highlight the dialectical worldview. But in short, a dialectical approach to the world, particularly as articulated in the Marxist tradition, is one that apprehends all phenomena as fundamentally in motion, as interconnected and in relationship with all other phenomena. This idea that higher levels of existence are rooted in and emerge from lower levels. You can think of humans evolving out of lower primates. That contradictions between and within phenomena propel their evolution, and that this process of evolutionary advance is governed by laws which are knowable. So this idea in particular really gives rise to what in philosophy is called a process philosophy, meaning that process philosophies apprehend all phenomena as processes instead of things or objects, right? They're not metaphysical, static things or objects or Platonic ideals, but that all phenomena, including you and I, including the cosmos itself, is in a constant, perpetual state of process, of unfolding, of development. And so in that way, both Buddhism and Marxism are process philosophies. And the dialectical worldview within Marxism is well known and understood. It's a core feature of the tradition. In Buddhism, they don't use words like dialectics, right? These are phrases that come out of European philosophy, German philosophy in particular, out of Hegel. Buddhism existed thousands of years before Hegel or Marx existed. But some core ideas within Buddhism are certainly dialectical. One, and there are many, but some that I highlight are no self or emptiness, which is this idea within Buddhism that nothing, including us, has a permanent, unchanging essence. There is no unchanging, abiding self or thing at the center of our subjective experience, and there is no permanent essence in any given, seemingly static object or thing. And of course, the other idea within Buddhism that I highlight is dependent origination, which is this idea that everything, including you and I, including the cosmos, including the earth, everything you can think of, is the product of near infinite causes and conditions coming together to allow something to exist. So one of the examples I often use is, and there's several, but we could talk about biting into a peach, right? On one level of experience, it is a static thing in your hand that you bite into, and this is a peach, and then you digest it, and that's it. But what gave rise to that peach? Well, through the concept of dependent origination, we can see that in order for that peach to exist at all, there had to be fertile soil. There had to be storms that bring in rain. There has to be a proper amount of sun. And then when you go back and say, well, how is the sun there? How do storms happen? You begin talking about, cosmology, physics, gravity. And so you can quickly, just from starting from something as simple as a piece of fruit in your hand, elaborate to the entire universe. That in some sense, the entire universe comes together to produce this thing here and now, which in and of itself is a process, because a peach, it starts as a seed, it grows, it becomes ripe. If you don't eat it, don't consume it, it decays and goes back into the earth as organic material. If you do consume it, it goes through your bodily processes, which extracts nutrients, giving you more life and energy, etc. So this idea of dependent origination is a really powerful and core feature of Buddhism. And outside of Buddhism, we can also think of a political context in which we can understand dependent origination and its power of analysis, because we can think about what we're told about billionaires, about rich people. What are we told in capitalist society? We're told that people are rich because they work really hard, they grind it out, they're talented or they're geniuses who, through hard work, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and determined grit, amass an amazing amount of wealth. But we know as socialists that all of that wealth and the very existence of a billionaire in and of itself is dependent upon a near infinite amount of causes and conditions. traditions. There is no billionaire without an army of workers and consumers. There is no wealth without countless generations of human toil by people that will never know their names and never remember their faces. In order for one man to amass all of that wealth and then to turn around and tell us he did it all by himself is, flagrant, fallacious, absolutely absurd by logical standards, by Marxist standards, and certainly by Buddhist standards through this concept of dependent origination. So you can see here that, both Marxism and Buddhism, very different traditions, very different cultural contexts, but both are basically advancing a worldview that is inherently dialectical. And because of that, you can take certain Marxist ideas and make more sense of them within Buddhism and vice versa, which perhaps we'll get into here as this conversation develops.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm recalling in a meditation once a teacher once said, okay, when I say, may I be well, we mean not the I, but, the phenomenon that is sitting here, the countless coordination of the many beings that are teeming on the surface of my skin and my gut, but also the phenomenon that is colloquially referred to as I, or Della, right? And that really nailed that point home for me. And also this phrase interbeing from the late teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. That's another way to think about this, that we all inter-are with everything else. And then, yes, this assumption that capitalism is somewhat ahistorical, right? That it's really, it doesn't have a very future thinking point of view, like I'm thinking of indigenous wisdom traditions and seven generation thinking, right? It doesn't consider the effect or the impact on the seventh generation from now, but it also right now doesn't seem to really appreciate the deep pain and suffering that has gone into the great wealth accumulation and the structures that we are currently in. So I really appreciate that. And I've heard a reframe that is, money is commodified grief. What if we saw money as commodified grief? To me, that speaks to the historical processes of those who have so much wealth, that it comes from primitive accumulation, but also processes of ongoing accumulation that, of course, come from deep suffering. So just, uplifting things that you're saying.
I think that's incredibly profound and very on point. And again, I was talking about the billionaire, but what we see more broadly in our society is this hyper individualism, this worship of the self, and this idea that everybody is a truly unique individual that gets what they deserve. So if you're poor, people won't come out and say it these days, but basically the idea is you're not morally worthy. You didn't work hard enough, you weren't smart enough, you didn't do the right things, and so the position you're in is wholly and exclusively a product of your own failings. And the opposite is true if somebody's rich. They got there because they worked really extra hard, they're way more talented, they apply their talent in the right way. And so we can see how capitalism just re-entrenches this idea of all of us as individual little islands unto ourselves that either make it or break it. But in reality, when you look at you or yourself, what are you really? You are a product of everybody you've ever come across. You're a product of your culture, the ideas that it gives you. You're a product of the genetics of your parents. You're a product of your early socialization. There is nothing about any one of us that is disconnected from the panoply of causes and conditions that gave rise to us. And so for us to then say, this is all mine, or that's all your fault, it's silly. And Marxists know this because we shift from individual failures to structural analysis. And Buddhists know this because they undermine the very idea that there's a separate abiding self that is called I, that actually exists. They undermine that entire idea and show how all of us are processes and dependent on dependent origination. So yeah, I think there's so much there. You could have an entire discussion just about the implications of dependent origination.
Yes. And I'm also hearing just the power of systems thinking, thinking systemically, both in terms of time, but also in systems. So let's go into the aim of Buddhism and Marxism. They both share it, of liberation. So what does that mean, liberation, to each of these paths or to each of these philosophical practices?
Yeah, that's another synergy that I point out, of course, the dialectical worldview, process philosophy, but also this idea that both of these traditions, in very different ways, but in complementary ways, seek liberation. So for Buddhism, there's an inner liberation, and for Marxism, there's an outer liberation. And we also understand through dialectics the need to bring the outer and the inner together in the unity of opposites, right? There's no night without day, there's no up without down. There's no inward without outward. So Marxism can definitely account for an analysis of the outward, and Buddhism can definitely account for an analysis of the inward, but they really shy away from doing the opposite. You don't hear Marxists talking about the self and the I and, the individual's experience, and you don't see Buddhists talking about the structural development of capitalism out of feudalism, right? Because they're fundamentally aimed in different directions. But I like to bring them together and see how there's a totality of liberation that can be achieved by these two seemingly different traditions. So in Buddhism, what do they mean by liberate? What's liberation within Buddhism? It can certainly mean sort of different things, and by necessity, there's a bunch of different sects and factions within Marxism and Buddhism, like there is in any tradition. So I'm speaking very generally about these traditions overall, and most of what I say is going to be shared by most factions within either one of these two major traditions. But Buddhism seeks to liberate human beings from the unnecessary suffering that stems inevitably from our constant desiring, our identification with our egos, and our desperate clinging and attachment to things that, by their very nature, change and dissolve away. We are always talking to ourselves in our heads. We are always grabbing at pleasure and trying to push pain away. We have this nagging sense of always being not quite satisfied, never quite complete. And so we spend our entire lives leaning forward into the future and backwards into the past, searching for something external to us that will finally make us happy and fulfilled, and trying to protect ourselves from all the pain and tragedy and despair in our lives by building up our psychological defense mechanisms and reifying our sense of separateness. So we're always extracting ourselves from the present moment, what is right here and right now, in anticipation for what's coming or in nostalgia for what we once had. So in a sense, we're a mess, and the world is a mess, according to Buddhism, because we're a mess, and every individual suffers in this way. So Buddhism seeks to liberate us from our delusions, our self-inflicted suffering, our desperate clinging and craving, and the faulty idea that we are located somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears, looking out at a world that is fundamentally not us, and acting as a trembling little commentator to our own lives. So to be liberated from all of this is to genuinely feel ourselves viscerally, completely at home in the world, completely at home in our own skin. It makes us feel in the highest levels of Buddhist liberation to be the very cosmos we think is outside of us, to neither cling to pleasures nor run from pain, but to live our lives in the present moment in deep equanimity, and to accept life and death as they come on their terms with love and compassion and joy in our hearts. So there is this deep sense in which Buddhism is seeking to liberate us from the delusions of mind, of ego identification, of this idea that we are put into a world that is fundamentally not us, and we're quaking and shivering and talking to ourselves in our heads until we're ultimately annihilated. And that is a scary thing, and we all sort of internalize that in various ways. And through Buddhist meditation specifically, but through the Eightfold Path more generally, Buddhism gives us a path toward liberating ourselves from all the unnecessary suffering that comes from those things that I mentioned above. And the Eightfold Path, of course, is the path to get there. So that is Buddhist idea of liberation, and that is the Buddhist path to liberation. Now, Marxism, as I said earlier, it seeks to liberate humanity as a whole, outwardly, from the exploitation, the irrationality, alienation, and injustice of class society in all of its forms. Marxism seeks a human civilization where human beings are no longer divided into rich and poor, into exploiter and exploited, into master and slave, into king and serf, to worker and boss, but rather a truly human civilization where equal and free human beings can cooperate in order to benefit all and to increase the quality of life for all people. So in a sense, Marxism aims toward a world in which we can be fully human for the first time, perhaps since primitive communism. Historical materialism within Marxism, talking about the path to get to this liberation. Historical materialism is the scientific approach to societies and their evolution over time in the Marxist tradition. So it's this attempt to study the development of societies through history by understanding the material, economic base of that society, how humans come together to produce and reproduce the necessities of life. That's the core locus of analysis for Marxists trying to understand societies and their evolution over time. And the dialectical materialism, if historical materialism is the scientific approach of Marxism, dialectical materialism is the sort of philosophical framework through which we think through historical materialism, where we can generate social analyses, we can strategize movements and build organizations dedicated to engaging in class struggle with the hopes of ultimately transcending this current mode of production and ultimately class society altogether. And the way we do that is engaging in class struggle consciously. That's the path. Though the form that that class struggle takes, of course, will differ dramatically between different societies at different times in different contexts. So, sort of summing up what I'm saying here, Buddhism is interested in the inward liberation of the human mind from sort of self-imposed limitations and delusions and the incessant fear-produced need to cling on to things that we like and to run away from things that hurt us. This running away and clinging doesn't get rid of suffering, it exacerbates it. It's pouring gas on the fire of suffering. And Buddhism shows us a way out. And then, of course, Marxism, in simplest terms, wants to seek humanity from dividing us up into classes. There should be, ultimately, no poor people and super rich people. There should not be a world in which we have billionaires that own everything and don't have to work, who live exclusively off the toil of other human beings, while huge masses of people suffer, live lives of extreme precarity, are brutally exploited for the billionaires' classes and the owning classes' profits, and who live half lives, deformed lives, so that the richest among us can live lives of utter luxury and opulence and unknown comfort.
So I just finished my reading section, and I've been reading the Communist newspaper the last few days while I catch up on this issue number 26 for August and September. And I was just deeply moved by an article in here, and it's about Emmett Doyle. And Emmett Doyle wrote a song about in my time as a political prisoner. So I'm just deeply grateful to the Communist newspaper and the crew that puts it out. I'm not a member of the RCA. I'm a financial contributor. I'm a financial sustainer, but I'm not an official member or a cadre or anything like that. And I just wanted to express my deep sympathy to Emmett Doyle and the Minnesota 15 activists. Please contribute to the defense fund. It looks like Emmett Doyle has lost his job as a part of Trump's retribution campaign against the Minnesota 15. So, yeah, we're going to move on to the meditation now. After I post a short video about Emmett Doyle so that I don't forget to do it later. Well, I guess I'll just do it later. Because I don't want to end the live stream. But please look up Emmett Doyle. EMMETT and he wrote a song about me that's just my name, Daniel Allen Baker, by Emmett Doyle. So now we'll sit and meditate for 30 minutes, and we'll listen to the nice man speak about Buddhism. Music back.
These are the things that Marxism is seeking to liberate us from. And it does so not by appealing to the morality of how bad things are, or coming up with ideas, sitting in your armchair about what the world should be like, but by actually analyzing the real world, analyzing contradictions in the current state of things, and seeking to, using those contradictions, move from the way things are now toward the way things could be, scientifically, methodically, organizationally. And so, yeah, I guess that would be my answer to that wonderful question.
Yeah, thank you. And just to highlight one phrase you used, you said something like Buddhism helps us in liberation from unnecessary pain. And I just want to highlight this idea, this distinction between suffering and pain in Buddhism, because there's this idea of the double arrow sutra, this idea that imagine you're hit with an arrow. That first arrow is pain. It's unavoidable, it's there. But suffering is the second arrow that we stick into the first arrow, and that is our perception or view on certain things. So just to distinguish that Buddhism isn't trying to liberate us from all negative sensations, feelings, experiences in life. In fact, it accepts that there is change, there is death, and there is aging or sickness, right? Like those are inevitable parts of life. But what Buddhism is trying to liberate us from is the mental formations or habits or clinging ways of thinking that we put on top of those sensations, on top of that pain. And so as you were speaking, I got this sense that in some way too, Marxism might appreciate that there are natural ways that we have pain in our lives. However, it makes a clear distinction of the ways that are human-made, capitalist-made, that is suffering. So that the division, the alienation, the exploitation, and the inequality, that is not inevitable. That is totally changeable. We can have an alternative system. So I just wanted to, appreciate that difference between pain and suffering in both Buddhism and Marxism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And like the two arrow is a great metaphor for this. And you know, the original arrow, the first arrow, is the pain, right? The pain of life. These things, this isn't the necessary suffering of being an embodied sentient being in the cosmos. We're going to deal with pain. It's not this, Buddhism is not this idea that you'll never have a negative experience ever again. Once you know, it's about reorienting not the outside world and reality, but your relationship to it. And interestingly, especially with like physical pain, just as an example, and perhaps you could speak to this as somebody who has practiced meditation, I find when you're incredibly mindful of something like stubbing your toe, right? What happens when you're walking around your house and unexpectedly you slam your pinky toe into the side of your couch? What happens is this huge rush of sensation flooding up to the brain. And what do most of us do most of the time? We resist that pain by clenching our face, screaming out so our partner knows we're in pain, grabbing our foot and hopping around like an idiot, right? That's what we do because there's
Holding our breath.
Exactly. A bunch of different things that we do because there's the initial pain stimulus, and then there's our rejection and our urge to get away from that pain, which is this second arrow of suffering that exacerbates the pain and the suffering. But in physical pain in particular, I find that the other option, especially if you're keeping up a Buddhist practice, because momentum within the practice I think is important to be able to meet things as they arise, you can start being interested in the sensation of pain. Now you slammed your toe into the couch and your body is being flooded with signals that say you need to start grabbing your foot and hopping around screaming cuss words. But if you could hold back on that reaction and just become curious of what actually is this pain? What is this sensation? You can start to break pain apart. You can start to see its constitutive parts, and what is really there is just intense sensation. You know, there's not really, I mean, there is pain, of course, that is what we call those intense sensations, but if you can disassociate that concept and just sort of address and look at and face the sensations themselves, I find that you can even turn physical pain into at least an interesting sensational experience. And that right there is not eradicating the sensations, but is refusing the second arrow, is refusing to suffer by rejecting and trying to wiggle out of and escape the pain that's there. And you can radically reorient your relationship with that physical pain as mere sensation, instead of trying to rub it away, get away from it through all the extra suffering that we do in that moment. And so I've found that is a really interesting part of my meditative practice of seeing pain as merely intense sensation and being curious about it as such. It can be a very powerful, sort of a practice to engage in. And I wonder if you have any experience with doing anything like that?
You know, I do. And I'm also thinking, though, around how Marxism can be a way to feel into or notice or honor the more societal or social pain. Like I'm using the same analogy that you're doing. For example, I remember learning about the concept of alienation And then having a friend who was hired as a designer, he did all this design work, and then he was let go, and his employer said that he couldn't bring any of his designs or have like a portfolio demonstrating anything that he had designed while working for this person. And I was like, oh, that is alienation. You were alienated from your artistic, creative, labor endeavors. And so that was a moment of pain, and Marxism gave me a word to be able to give in that moment to this person to explain his experience, and that can be a path to liberation. This is why one thing we're interested in is liberation psychology. This idea that we can feel into our societal pain, but when we're given a name for it, like class consciousness or alienation or exploitation or understanding why it is that we're feeling a certain way and pathways to alternatives, the lens of Marxism on our pain can be very liberating.
Absolutely love that. Yeah, I love how you're taking the other side of what I'm saying about Buddhism and applying it to Marxism so wonderfully. And you said something earlier too about necessary versus unnecessary suffering that I think is really interesting, and you attached it to capitalism. I just kind of want to flesh that out a little bit, because there is the necessary suffering of life. We've talked about it in the Buddhist context, but just in the existential context, like, what is life? Well, we're born through no choice of our own into an incredibly imperfect world, right? The birthing process itself is painful and traumatic. We're socialized into pretty rotten societies, at least if you take the last 1,000 years of slave societies, feudal societies, capitalist societies. We are born into a world in which everybody that came before us, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, everybody we love, slowly dies one by one until it's our turn to fall into the grave and say goodbye to everybody else who's still alive that we love. Life already is suffering, and these are this like life and death thing, and our grappling with it is a necessary part of our existence that can never be washed away. We can never get out of the fact that we are finite creatures in a finite cosmos, and we one day will die after watching everybody we love die. That is horrific, but the true state of things at some level. Then on top of that necessary suffering, in the capitalist epoch, is all this other suffering that nobody should have to put up with. It's not necessary. It is imposed socially, culturally, systematically on us. And that is the suffering of not being able to get health care because you can't afford it. The suffering of having a low self-worth because you live in a society with minimal class mobility and you were born into a lower class family, but our society tells you if you're not rich and successful and famous, then your life is a failure, and you internalize that not as a structural problem of capitalism, but often people internalize that as a character flaw, as I did not live up to my potential, I did not make it, and you struggle to pay bills, all the indignities of having your house foreclosed on, losing your job and your sense of self-esteem and your ability to provide for your family, right? And then you go and turn on the TV and you're dazzled by this spectacle of people in Ferraris and Bugattis with $450,000 watches like DJ Khaled, more money on his little wrist than you will ever have in your entire life and your kid's life combined at any one time. This is the unnecessary suffering imposed on us by a class society. And of course, I'm talking about capitalism, but think about feudalism. Think about ancient slave societies. All class societies divide people up into categories of exploiter and exploited, as I was saying earlier, rich and poor, etc. That entire structure of imposing class divisions on humanity causes so much unnecessary suffering, whether it's feudal, slave, or capitalistic. And so I think that dichotomy between necessary and unnecessary pain and suffering has a lot of traction, whether we're talking about Buddhism or we're talking about Marxism.
You're listening to an Upstream conversation with Brett O'Shea, host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of Red Menace, Guerrilla History, and, most recently, Shoeless in South Dakota. We'll be right back.
why I've gone on and on. Why I've climbed up alone. But actual negation, when your person is gone and the bedroom door yawns, there is nothing to learn. Her absence is a scream. Saying nothing. Conceptual emptiness was cool to talk about back before I knew my way around these hospitals. I would like to forget and go back into imagining that snow shining permanently alone could say something to me true and comforting.
That was Emptiness Part 2 by Mount Erie. Now, back to our conversation with Brett O'Shea.
And so, moving from the experience of necessary and unnecessary pain, let's move to the causes. Because I think Buddhism and Marxism really do offer kind of an understanding of why. Why are we in these certain systems or structures that are bringing about so much unnecessary suffering? So, can you tell us about the three poisons in Buddhism and how it also relates to a Marxist view? And looking at this in the relationship between the causes of the unnecessary suffering that we are experiencing under capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. But within Buddhism, the three poisons are known as greed, ill will or hatred, and delusion. So let's do greed, ill will, and delusion. These are the three poisons. And they are features of the unenlightened human mind. And when they are present in the mind, and importantly, when one is identified with them, they wreak havoc on an individual's psyche. They bolster the ego delusion and create suffering for all involved. And while Buddhism talks about this stuff almost exclusively in terms of the mind, your own personal struggle with your insatiable greed, your desiring and wanting things, and like the ugliness that comes out when you have a chance to grab what you want, even if it's at the expense of somebody else, or ill will in the way our ego finds people to hate and be disgusted by and want to hurt, and delusion, all the ways in which we're ignorant about how reality actually is, and how that ignorance of reality drives our own suffering and makes us actually the perpetuators in so many ways of unnecessary suffering within ourselves. So while Buddhism, again, talks about this exclusively in terms of the mind, I think it's quite natural to argue that if most people, as Buddhists say, are susceptible to these poisons, that when you get a bunch of people who are susceptible to these poisons together in a society, they can be instantiated not just at the individual psychological level, but also on the collective social political level. And so it's my argument that capitalism, in many ways, institutionalizes, not creates, these three poisons. Because the Buddha was talking about these three poisons being present in the human mind, 2,500 years ago. But institutionalizes them, attempts to naturalize them, and then by doing so exacerbates their intensity on both the individual and the collective levels. So, what is greed under capitalism if not the urge to profit at all costs, right? When you're a CEO of a company, structurally, you have a fiduciary responsibility to increase profit margins for your shareholders as much as you possibly can. And if you start getting sentimental about how you're treating the workers or how the environment's being degraded by the poisons you're producing, and you start thinking maybe we should pay our workers a little bit more, and maybe we should, put a few more of our costs and our revenue towards blunting our terrible environmental impact, what's going to happen? You're going to be fired and replaced. And so I think it's important when we're talking about greed in the Buddhist context, this is an individual problem, the person that's greedy. But structurally, this has been institutionalized. So it's not just an individual problem. And if an individual in a certain position of power within the capitalist hierarchy decides that he wants to fight against the greed in himself or in his company, he will be easily replaced. And this is why structural analysis is more important than moralism. A lot of times you'll hear liberals say, oh, Jeff Bezos, or billionaire here, is so greedy. If only we had a less greedy person that was more willing to share his revenue with Amazon workers and all of this, like this greed of this guy is terrible. But it's not the guy. Of course the guy is also greedy, but he's incentivized by an entire structure to be as greedy as fucking possible. And if you're not super fucking greedy, you don't maximize profits at all costs, you will be replaced. And then there's ill will. What is ill will, if not, in the capitalist context, the colonial expansion, the genocide, the slavery, the primitive accumulation that it took to build capitalism, the closing off of the commons, and then the modern day imperialist wars and brutality and bombings going on right now as we speak that maintains the domination of the American empire and its fundamental value of protecting corporations and their ability to profit at all costs. This going out to Iraq, destroying an entire country, turning it over, ruining countless lives, going over to Afghanistan, doing the same, all for nothing, really. What was gained by humanity, by the people of Iraq, by the people of America, by these adventures? Absolutely nothing. What is delusion, if not the ideologies that come along with capitalism, right? Marxism tells us that the ruling ideas in any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. This is what we mean Marxist-wise when we say ideological conditioning, ideological propaganda. We are given the values and ideas of the ruling class and then internalize them as our own. So you have a guy who's making $30,000 a year arguing against raising taxes on the rich or against universal health care, not because it's actually in his direct financial interests, but because he has been conditioned with an ideology of our rulers who want to profit more than they want to take care of human beings. So these are just some examples. We could sit back all day and think about the ways in which delusion is instituted in capitalism, the ways in which ill will. I mean, one way that jumps to mind right now, ill will, is like the intense competitive nature of the free market, where you and your coworkers are alienated from one another and you're pitted against one another for who's going to get that promotion, right? Or you're in the unemployment line and somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I'll hire you at my job because my workers are striking. They want $15 an hour. That's disgusting. I'll pay you $10 an hour to come scab. It's better than the $0 an hour you're getting. And so in so many ways, these are just a couple that jump to mind, we're pitted against our fellow human beings for the interest of other people that are not us or the people we're pitted against. It's for the interest of a ruling class that profits from us being pitted against each other. Another thing that jumps to mind, racism. You cannot understand class divisions in capitalism within American society in particular without understanding the role that racism has played historically and presently in pitting working class desperate people against one another for the benefit of people that are not us. And so in all of these ways, these things are already present in the human mind. They manifest through history in different societies and different cultural contexts. We can make this exact same argument for the feudal context, right? Greed, ill will, and delusion. How did those things manifest in feudal monarchies? How did they manifest in ancient slave societies? Wherever there's class society, these things are institutionalized in one way or another. But we live under capitalism, and so those are some of the ways that capitalism institutionalizes those three poisons. Now, from a Buddhist point of view, and this is some of the limitations of spiritual communities in particular, is you'll often hear, and I'm sure you've heard this too, Yes, but you can't go out and do anything really about it. The best thing you can do is not attack necessarily the institutions that incentivize these things, but to root it out in your own mind. And there's some truth to that. If you did the work of following the Eightfold Path and uprooting greed, ill will, and delusion within yourself, you're going to be a better neighbor, a better partner, a better father, mother, husband, wife, friend, community member, right? You might even inspire a couple people in your life to do the same. Wow, this transformation and so was so profound. This meditation has changed their life so much. Maybe I'll get into it, right? And even if you don't, you're creating good vibes and good karma to the people around you because you're not dominated by greed, ill will, and delusion. But that has limitations. And the idea that everybody or most people in the world are going to sit down and meditate their way to uprooting greed, ill will, and delusion in enough time to save humanity from the environmental apocalypse or nuclear war or whatever, I think is incredibly sort of naive. And so it's important in its own right, but you have to have both sides of that puzzle. We have to not only work on uprooting those things within ourselves through meditation practice, but we also have to find ways to challenge those things on the institutional, structural, and collective levels through political organization and struggle. And so this is another way in which concepts within Buddhism can be made sense of within Marxism and even elevated in some way, taken from the individual realm, which is still essential, but also applied to the external outward realm, which is crucial for a totalizing approach to uprooting these problems. Now, if you're a Marxist and you want to attack these institutions, the way that these things are institutionalized, but you yourself have not even thought about doing the internal work to uproot greed, ill will, and delusion within yourself, right? That's going to dramatically impact and limit your ability to take these things on institutionally, collectively, and politically. So these are two sides of a very important coin. And if you only do one side of that coin, you're doing good in the world for sure. It's better than doing nothing. But in and of itself, it's incredibly limited. And so I see this bringing together of these two traditions, and using these conceptual tools within Buddhism and Marxism to complement one another and to fill out the other side of that picture. And so with greed, ill will, and delusion, I think I've sort of articulated how that might make sense. But again, there's so much more to be said on this front.
Yeah, Brad, I totally hear you. That yes, when we think, oh, I just need to heal myself or get my own mental formations, in check and really root out greed, hatred, and delusion in myself, like that'll take so long, and that really is quite a sedentary and very like quiet, reflective path, and really. This time on earth is really calling us to get off the cushion and bring our spiritual practices into action. And yet I'm also thinking of the beautiful Robert M. Pirsig quote from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He says, if a factory is torn down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then that rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys a systematic government, but systematic patterns of thought that produce that government are left intact, those patterns will repeat themselves. So it is this interesting both and, the inner and the outer transformation that is necessary. And this brings me to one of the things that I kind of see as maybe we went over the commonalities and the synergies of Buddhism and Marxism. I see as one of the potential differences, and I'm really curious to hear what you think. So it's this idea that in Buddha's view, there's a real sense of equanimity, right? Equanimity in my mind is like seeing beauty in the microwave as well as the flower, like really holding things kind of with a impartiality, a lack of attachment, and kind of appreciation for all things, but also being equanimous to all things. And it also has a quality of loving kindness to all beings. That's another element of Buddhist view, is loving kindness. And the delusion part of Buddhism, the rooting out delusion, is rooting out a sense of like othering, like separation and othering. And so then when I think of Marxism, and at least some of the words and phrases that are used, like class war, class struggle, right? It has a very oppositional frame. Like there is us and them. And, there's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, for example. So I'm struggling with how to tap into this Buddhist view of equanimity and loving kindness, and even what you said about how the billionaire, yes, they may be personally greedy, and yet the system is also that they're a part of is also reproducing or encouraging them to be greedy. So I'm holding that with this very, very also helpful view of understanding who are capitalists and what is that separation and the very real class struggle. So I'm just curious what you think about that dynamic. I'm also thinking of a quote by the Buddha: hatred is never ended by hatred, but by love. And I'm like hearing that and thinking of Marxist texts and Marxist analysis. So I'm just wondering, how do you see this tension that I've laid out? Maybe you don't, or you do, and how do you reconcile with it?
Yeah, great question. And I'm not going to be able necessarily to do an exhaustive answer, but I'll definitely give some thoughts and would love to hear yours as well. First thing that jumps to mind is under capitalism, everyone suffers. So there's this sense in which, yes, rich people live lives of opulence and luxury and comfort, but we often see, and it's portrayed very well in popular culture, how when they get the money and the fame and the status that capitalism incentivizes them to get, they still so often find this yawning void within their souls that's still there. And it's extra scary and extra bad because you were taught your entire life that by getting fame and money and status, you could make that feeling of not being whole, of not being worthy or whatever, go away. And the neurosis produced by having insane amounts of money when in your very city, people are sleeping on the concrete in tents, crime is on the uptick, society and the fabric of it is falling apart, and your very role in that, whether it's conscious or not, creates suffering within you. If only the fear of one day this money being taken from you, of one day the barbarians knocking down the gates and flooding into your gated community and taking all the things that, whether you think about it consciously or not, you know you didn't fully get in a just way. You know, and I don't like talking about this in the sense that I don't like to compare the neurotic suffering of the rich to the material suffering of the poor, but there is a way in which the insanity of capitalism makes everybody suffer in different ways. So that's the first thought. So Buddhists are concerned with ending suffering. We should at least think about the suffering on all parts of that spectrum, because it would allow us to feel perhaps some compassion on a human level for a figure within capitalism who is noxious. For example, and this gets to your point, can you feel compassion for Donald Trump? Can you see the Donald Trump within yourself? Can you feel for a little boy Donald Trump who clearly did not get the love and validation he needed from probably his dad or maybe both his parents, and whose ego was distorted in such a fantastic way that it produced the man we see today? A man with no real inner depth, no sense of connection to friends or everybody is just a transaction to be used. Every assault is an assault only on the ego. The ego is the only thing that needs to be defended, and the more he tries to defend it, the more people hate him and attack him, right? Now, on one level, I can feel compassion for them. I can feel the little Trump within me that is narcissistic as fuck, that wants to give into every ego craving, that wants the validation of other people, but doesn't want to look like I need the validation of anyone, right? That person is within us, but it's brought to monstrous proportions in the figure of Trump. So, okay, let's say yes. I can feel compassion, even love, for Donald Trump. I can imagine him as a 5-year-old boy who just wanted a fucking hug and wanted his dad to say he's proud of him, right? At the same time, look at the suffering he unleashes on others. Look how he takes his own suffering and puts it onto other people, right? Through these immigration bans, through the re-entrenchment and resurgence of fascist groups and organizations, through the ideological conveying and dog whistling about who the real Americans are and who the non-real Americans are, leading to spikes in hate crimes and more suffering. So this is a figure whose internal suffering is not addressed, is not looked at directly, is projected out onto the rest of the world, and makes other people suffer. So on one hand, you can feel deep compassion and understanding for him. On another hand, you have to stop the suffering he's imposing. And I'm just using Trump as a specific figure, but you can think about anybody throughout history or even today that has this impact on people. So then if you're totally in the feeling love and compassion for Trump, and you're not in the, what about the suffering he's helping cause for so many other people? It's only one side of the coin, right? So with that in mind, I think that there is something to this idea of the dialectical unity of opposites. It's precisely our love for others that pushes us into the fight against those who would hurt them, right? It is my love for human beings sleeping on the street that makes me want to go out and do whatever it takes to get that person a home, even if it means confronting and fighting with, maybe even going to war with other human beings, right? It's our embrace of class war is often out of love for other sentient beings. This dialectical reality is brought to a sharp point with both quotes from Mao and Che. Che would talk about a revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. Communism is love in some sense. And what does Mao say? Communism is not love. Communism is the annihilation of the enemy. Communism the power grows out of the barrel of the gun. It is destroying our enemies. That both of those things can be true at the same exact time. And you have to ask yourself, what suffering, unnecessary suffering, is being caused by this system? And then, once you figure that out, what would it take to actively confront this system? And when you say, what does it take to confront the system, what you're really talking about, what does it take to confront the people who have all the wealth and power and who make all the rules and who this unjust order, it solely or almost exclusively benefits them? What do we do about those people? Because they're not just going to one day wake up with compassion flooding out of their heart and hand over their $1 billion and the reins to political power to the working class. So look at the suffering capitalism and imperialism and colonialism cause around the world. Okay, that's terrible. It's unnecessary. We want to end that unnecessary suffering. And then the minute you start saying, how do I do it? You have two options. Well, it's going to be ugly. So either I'm going to not do it because I have this sort of a priori commitment to nonviolence and peace. So I'm just not going to engage with the political realm at all. I'll just turn inward. Or you say, I'm willing to weaponize my love in the fight for justice. And I'm willing to take on other people who want to entrench this unjust system of suffering and impose misery on countless people so that they can live with as much power and wealth as they currently have. It is a tough issue. But again, you have to, I think, see it from both sides. So a great challenge for us is to try to hold both simultaneously. Can we love other human beings while we struggle against them? Can we relate to and even feel compassion for those who are totally lost in greed and ill will and delusion, while at the same time challenging that greed, ill will, and delusion? Are we lost in our polarity, or can we see the totality, right? We need darkness to appreciate light. We need death to appreciate life. We need hate to appreciate love. So we can play our role on the side of light and life and love without losing our place in the totality, without seeing the darkness within ourselves, the death within ourselves, the hate within ourselves, right? And so it might not be a perfect answer. There's contradictions are still going to exist in this realm. Different Buddhists and different Marxists will come to different conclusions about this question. But I believe something important is in this sort of attempt to hold both simultaneously and to challenge ourselves on both levels. It's hard to think of having compassion for a Hitler, right? Even unthinkable, even disgusting to even utter those words. But it's even more unthinkable to not challenge that Hitler when he starts the Holocaust. And if that means putting a bullet in Hitler's head to stop the imposed misery, destruction, and annihilation of 6 million Jewish people, are you going to say, I can't do violence? Or are you going to say, hey, this is the real world. It's fucking messy. This fucking asshole is causing insane misery and suffering for countless innocent people. And while I can be on some level compassionate and sympathetic with what turned him into this monster, it doesn't stop him from being a monster until we stop him. And so you can engage in violence with love in your heart. Maybe not always, maybe not all the time, maybe not even very often, but it's at least possible. And if that's a possibility, I think it's a possibility that we should think very deeply about. But again, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I do think this one thing you said about, if one is committed to nonviolence and peace, that it means that they turn inwards. And I do want to say that in some very inspiring ways, I have seen people who would call themselves engaged Buddhists or engaged spiritual people who who turn towards nonviolence in a more active way. Like I'm thinking about the self-immolation of the monk in Vietnam as a
about this question. But I believe something important is in this sort of attempt to hold both simultaneously and to challenge ourselves on both levels. It's hard to think of having compassion for Hitler, right? Even unthinkable, even disgusting to even utter those words. But it's even more unthinkable to not challenge that Hitler when he starts the Holocaust. And if that means putting a bullet in Hitler's head to stop the imposed misery, destruction, and annihilation of 6 million Jewish people, are you going to say, I can't do violence? Or are you going to say, hey, this is the real world. It's fucking messy. This fucking asshole is causing insane misery and suffering for countless innocent people. And while I can be on some level compassionate and sympathetic with what turned him into this monster, it doesn't stop him from being a monster until we stop him. And so you can engage in violence with love in your heart. Maybe not always, maybe not all the time, maybe not even very often, but it's at least possible. And if that's a possibility, I think it's a possibility that we should think very deeply about. But again, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I do think this one thing you said about, you know, if one is committed to nonviolence and peace, that it means that they turn inwards. And I do want to say that in some very inspiring ways, I have seen people who would call themselves engaged Buddhists or engaged spiritual people who turn towards nonviolence in a more active way. Like I'm thinking about the self-immolation of the monk in Vietnam as an anti-war protest, or even more recently in April of last year, there was a man named Win Bruce who also self-immolated in protest of climate change. And so I do think maybe there's stages, maybe the efforts first are nonviolent, but not nonviolent as in passive, but nonviolent as in active, if it's possible to prevent the bullet to the head of someone first. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I do find a lot of courageous actions of nonviolence in particularly the engaged Buddhist world.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's a beautiful thing. I think if you can achieve your goals through peace, that is always and everywhere the preferred option. And there have been historical movements that have, successfully sort of, I don't want to say but kind of weaponized peace. You can think of the civil rights struggle, the MLK side of the civil rights fight that was very dedicated to this idea that we're not going to fight back. We're going to be incredibly peaceful. They're definitely going to get violent. They're going to brutalize us, and we're going to use our own brutalization. It's kind of like self-immolation on a lower level, right? We're going to let ourselves be hurt and beat up and sometimes even fucking killed, and we're not going to fight back. We're not going to meet hate with hate. We're going to meet hate with love. And that was a very effective movement. But importantly, it wasn't the only part of that movement. On the other half of the civil rights struggle, you had the Black Panther Party. You had the Black Liberation Army. You had the Malcolm X's of the world, the Nation of Islam. These people who were ready to engage in violence to protect themselves and their families and their loved ones. Malcolm X's house was firebombed. They threw a bomb into his baby's bedroom where multiple of his children were sleeping because they hated him, right? And so when you're met with that level of immediate, direct violence against totally fucking innocent people, only for the gall of saying we should be equal human beings, peace and civil disobedience and nonviolent forms of protest can quickly meet their limitation. And in the case of self-immolation, I think that is a admirable, incredibly courageous, sort of stunning approach to a problem. Like, I'm not going to inflict this harm and misery on anybody else, but I'm willing to annihilate my own being to bring attention to this issue. But I have to ask, at the risk of sounding callous, which I'm not intending to be, what did it accomplish? Did it stop anything? I mean, even in that last instance where the guy self-immolated on the White House lawn or whatever to end climate change, he was in the news for a day, and then it went away. Nobody barely even remembers. It was almost immediately memory hold. Nothing politically changed. Not a single drop of carbon was prevented from flying into the atmosphere. And so while it's noble, admirable, fascinating, I can't even imagine the courage and bravery and selflessness it takes to take a stand like that, there's also the question of efficacy. And that really has to come in with it. And there's this level of socially engaged Buddhism that I think, through its association and commitment to nonviolence, can really sort of, in my opinion, degenerate into a sort of lukewarm liberalism. A sort of walking around with signs that the people in power are so protected, their power and wealth is so protected by the violence of the state that they laugh at the idea that 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people holding signs, walking peacefully through the streets is going to do anything. In fact, they don't even notice. They don't even look out their windows. It is so irrelevant to them and their day and their week and their year. It makes no impact whatsoever. Maybe in certain political situations with certain real democracies, people engaging in robust, peaceful efforts to overcome injustice can make headway. If we had a real democracy, perhaps we could do it totally peacefully. That would be our preference. I hate the idea of hurting people, of people dying, of violence. Look at the 2020 protests, Black Lives Matter. How many people were killed? You know, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile. These names will forever be in my brain as totally innocent human beings doing absolutely nothing wrong, gunned down by a racist, white supremacist, militarized American police force rooted in slavery, right? These are the injustices and the brutalities and the violences being inflicted on innocent people. And if you're going to only meet that brutality and that violence, that organized violence, with mere peaceful, symbolic protests, I think in some instances it can work. In many it can't. And I look at the current American situation, the current power and hegemony domestically of the violent American state, and I see how they respond to even a initially incredibly peaceful Black Lives Matter protest. They respond to it with rubber bullets and tear gas and attack dogs and tanks in our streets. So if you're going to want to seriously commit to peaceful resistance, I get it. I think it's admirable. I think it's lovely. But you have to admit that if it's ever going to be effective, it at the very least also needs a certain group of people who share your ideals, except the part about not being violent. Because when you try to take power and money away from the most powerful, wealthy people in the world, they will meet you with violence every time. And if you're going to meet them with your hands in the air, you're going to get shot in the face. And again, I have deep love and appreciation and admiration for people who engage in that. But I think there are deep limitations to it. And if you're really serious about changing this world, eventually, when you get to a certain, we should do it as peacefully as we can. And we should never be the first to start the violence. But the moment you get too far, you will be met with extreme, insane violence. And you're going to have to at least think very deeply about how you and your organization and your movement is going to react to it. Having said that, there are a whole bunch of terrible things that come with non-peaceful protest and militant forms of activism. It immediately escalates the violent sort of spiral. Good people are killed. Innocent people who might just be associated with your organization often get killed, right? With Black Lives Matter and stuff, there was like these hate crimes against black people, for example. Not the people out on the street necessarily, but just because people were angry at the idea that black people in general were standing up for their rights, would take it out on any random black person. And that's in the context of, you know, Black Lives Matter was both peaceful and militant and had both sides of that coin. And innocent people catch the backlash often. So again, neither side of this coin is without its own specific deep issues. And again, I come back to this idea of granting legitimacy to both sides of that coin and to seeing how one side helps bolster the other and vice versa. And then quickly on the question of violence in general within Buddhism, you know, what if you are, just a classic example, in America this is all too classic and all too common, a mass shooter, right? Non-violence. I don't believe in violence. I cannot hurt somebody else. But this person is actively hurting innocent people. So do I set aside my commitment, my laudable and admirable commitment to peaceful resistance and take this person out because they are hurting others? You know, or do I stick to my peaceful protest, maybe stand in front of him, maybe be one of his victims, maybe prevent him by killing me. He doesn't kill an extra innocent person. But you can see how that has limitations, and you can see how it would not be unjust to take out that mass shooter with extreme violence and prejudice to save others. And that is always the question of violence. That is always the ethical conundrum of violence, is how do you not use violence against somebody who is so willing to use violence against people you care about, love, and who are totally innocent. So So this is a very complicated picture, but again, I go back to we need both sides of that coin.
Thank you, and I really just appreciate the delicateness of this question and really the nuances, because it really is a complex question, and yet very very alive for our movements and activism, and also for thinking about how do we get to the future, the post-capitalist communist economic system that we want to have. So these are really really delicate and great things to speak through. And so I want to ask about the Bodhisattva revolutionary, because it's also related to this. So this idea that you've offered in your talks is that combining, right, communist revolutionary and the Bodhisattva path. And so would you tell us about that idea, and also frame it in terms of invitations for our listeners? Like, how might someone listening start on this path or act on this path inspired by this transition, this change that we want to see?
Sure. Well, for this, I think I am just going to read directly from that essay. It's only a couple paragraphs. It's my concluding essay, but I really think I try to tie everything together very well and answer all your questions in one with this. So let me read this out, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think about this idea. This is just an idea that I came up with when I'm thinking about Marxism and Buddhism and the ways they interlap. You know, as my concluding sort of call to arms, if you will, I advanced this idea of the Bodhisattva revolutionary. So let me just read this last part that I wrote about it and flesh this out. So today I've argued that Marxism can benefit from a sincere engagement with Buddhism, and that Buddhism in turn can benefit from a sincere engagement with Marxism. I hope I've outlined effectively the primary goals of each tradition, the ways in which their philosophical orientations share a deeply dialectical lens, and the ways in which each tradition could benefit and deepen the other. To end, I want to leave you with an image, an archetype, if you will, that synthesizes everything I've said here today into a template that each of us, insofar as we are more or less convinced of what I've been arguing for, can adopt and strive to fulfill. This archetype is what I call the Bodhisattva revolutionary. Now, we all know what a revolutionary is. It is someone committed to confronting the injustice and inequality and suffering that are ubiquitous in class society, and working to build a better, more just, more equitable, egalitarian world. The revolutionary is selfless, dedicated to the people, and shaking with indignation at every injustice. Figures like Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara, Rosa Luxemburg, and many, many others jump to mind. All of these people mentioned were also willing to pay the ultimate price for their vision of a better world. All three of them were brutally murdered by agents of the status quo, of capitalism, of fascism, of imperialism. Their images are seared into our brains, and we strive to contribute even a fraction of what they did to the project of building a better world. Now we must combine that with the image of the Bodhisattva, that figure within Mahayana Buddhism who, in one telling, is an already enlightened being who, out of pure loving compassion for other sentient beings, remains in the cycle of samsara and forgoes nirvana simply in order to save others. Now that version might be too ideal for many of us who are anything but enlightened, and of course I count myself among the unenlightened. The other version of the Bodhisattva is a little more realistic. It is someone who is on the path towards Buddhahood and who commits themselves to dedicating their entire life and their whole being to the alleviation of suffering in others. The Bodhisattva is selfless in an even deeper sense than the revolutionary, because she seeks to actively dismantle the illusion of a separate self and uses the insights gained from that endeavor to better understand and thus help other sentient beings. Bodhisattvas set for themselves the impossible task of ending all suffering and helping all beings to awaken. They vow not to enter nirvana themselves until all beings can enter it together, hand in hand. By combining these archetypes, one Marxist and one Buddhist, we can create for ourselves a well-balanced ideal to strive for. Instead of dedicating our lives to careerism, the accumulation of wealth, and the pursuit of high status within the capitalist framework, as we are trained to do, we reject all of that and dedicate our lives instead to alleviating the suffering of other beings, confronting courageously the forces of oppression and hate and greed, and toppling structures of domination and exploitation and suffering in order to build an egalitarian civilization rooted in interconnectedness, justice, truth, beauty, and solidarity. A world where no one sleeps in the gutters. A world where no one goes without health care or food. A world in which no one goes without an education. In a world where no one suffers in totally avoidable and unnecessary ways so that others may live lives of extreme opulence. So let us all strive to embody within ourselves the Bodhisattva revolutionary ideal. And that's kind of how I ended the speech and tied Buddhism and Marxism together into a practical template that any individual can strive to work towards. And I think, again, going back to this idea that we've been batting around this entire conversation of both sides of the coin, I think the Bodhisattva revolutionary really embodies that idea of having both and using both to end suffering in all the unnecessary ways that it exists internally and externally.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just to highlight some of the things from this conversation that I'm taking with me, one of them is, I really love what you said about that under capitalism, everyone suffers. And I think about the book, The Spirit Level by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, and about this idea that under capitalism, everyone is worse off in terms of physical and mental health, in terms of drug abuse, trust, discordance with neighbors, violence, etc. And so it's this idea that we can do something different and that it would be better for everyone. So that was a really heartening thing. And then I also recalled the Tibetan Shambhala warrior prophecy, as you were speaking about how the billionaire may be greedy, but it's really the structure that they are acting in that also encourages and enables their greed. In the Shambhala warrior prophecy, the Tibetan prophecy, they say that our weapons are monomaya. They are made by the human mind, and therefore they can be unmade by the human mind. So capitalism is not necessary. It's not ever present, right? It can change. We can have something different. So not only can we have something different, but it would be better for all. And then finally, this Bodhisattva revolutionary, really combining the two practices of Marxism and Buddhism, is really saying, while the Buddhism can help uplift greed, hatred, and delusion within, and also address the suffering, that second arrow that we inflict on ourselves, we bring in Marxism to be able to address that second arrow that we inflict in terms of our social structures and institutions. Again, not necessary. And also Marxism as a way to uproot greed, hatred, and delusion societally, culturally. So just thank you so much for this beautiful combination of these two practices and what we can learn from them. Any last words?
Yeah, all I would say is thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate this conversation, and I really appreciated your insights as well. I feel like we could go for several more hours talking about some of this stuff, but the big thing I want to emphasize at the end here is that change is the only constant. What emerges from both Buddhism and Marxism is that all of life is nothing but a continuous cascade of relentless change. And why that is threatening to the status quo is because those at the very top of the capitalist world order want to naturalize it. They want to make it synonymous with human nature. They want to basically pretend that this is the end-all, be-all of economic systems and arrangements. And while it might need some finagling around the edges, it might need some reforms here and there, we've pretty much arrived at the end of history, economically speaking, and that capitalism is here to stay. But everything within Marxism, within Buddhism, within process philosophy, and within dialectics says that change is the only constant. And so we should never fall prey to these attempts to naturalize these fleeting, ephemeral systems. And we should work with that idea in our head that change is constant, work toward the next change, the change out of capitalism and toward communism, that thing that we call socialism. And so I think that is something to definitely keep in mind going forward, and to resist any attempt by anyone to naturalize a fundamentally unjust social order.
You've been listening to an Upstream conversation with Brett O'Shea, host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of Red Menace, Guerrilla History, and, most recently, Shoeless in South Dakota. Please check the show notes for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode. Thank you to Carolyn Rader for this episode's cover art, and to Mount Erie for the intermission music. Upstream theme music was composed by me, Robbie. Support for this episode was provided by the Resist Foundation and listeners like you. Upstream is a labor of love. We couldn't keep this project going without the generosity of our listeners and fans. Please consider chipping in a one-time or recurring donation at upstreampodcast.org/support. And because we're fiscally sponsored by the nonprofit Independent Arts and Media, all donations to Upstream in the US are tax exempt. Also, if your company or organization wants to sponsor one of our upcoming episodes, we have a number of sponsorship packages available. Find out more at upstreampodcast.org/sponsorship. For more from us, visit upstreampodcast.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates and post-capitalist memes at Upstream Podcast. You can also subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps Upstream get in front of more eyes and into more ears. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. So, on today's episode, I'm going to be reading a speech that I wrote for an event that I was invited to at Arizona State University. A Marxist-Leninist organization called MECHA got together with a Zen Buddhist club on campus called the Zen Devils, and they came together and they were thinking who could be a good speaker that would come and sort of bridge the gap between our two organizations, one Marxist and one Buddhist. And someone thought of me, Brett from Rev Left. And so, luckily, they are on the same campus as Professor Alexander Avina, who's a friend of mine and multiple guests on Rev Left and on Grill Industry at this point as well. They reached out to him, got my email through him, invited me out, and through their university compensated me quite nicely for the speaker's fee. And I went out there this past week and I performed a speech. I did a 2-hour podcast beforehand with Chewy from Mecha, which I'll release as soon as he sort of edits, finishes it up, sends it over to me. I'll put it out on our platform as well. He hosts a podcast called Heatwave, which I highly recommend people go check out. And again, shortly it'll be on the Rev Left feed. When we post that podcast episode, I'll also make sure to link to Heatwave and their organization so people can check it out. But it was a wonderful trip, and I did this speech, and it was very well received, and overall incredibly enjoyable. And I wanted to be able to share this speech with more people. And importantly, is if you are at a university, if you are a part of a club or an organization on campus, if you think I might be an interesting speaker to come out and talk to your organization, feel free to invite me. It is kind of hard to get a hold of me. I've tried very hard, especially early on, to keep up with all messages, all DMs, everything. That fell apart as soon as our platform reached a certain size, so I can't always be responding to emails and everything. But if you send an email, if you actually work it out with your university, and you have an opening to invite me to your campus to speak on any topic you think is relevant or that I would have something interesting to say on, you can reach out to therevolutionaryleft@gmail.com. Just please make sure you put in your header university invitation for speaker, or speaker at university, or inviting Brett to come to the university to speak, some combination of those words, so that my audio engineer guy, when he's scanning through the hundreds of emails we have, can sort of pick those out and see what the opportunity is. It's not only a wonderful opportunity for me to travel and see a new city and visit a new campus, but for me to meet listeners, something that I don't often get to do. To be able to go out and actually engage with and meet, talk to people who find the show valuable, or that like the show or whatever. It's a wonderful opportunity, and it feels great, and it's awesome, and I appreciate it, and I would love to do it again if the opportunity ever arises. So huge shout out to the Zen Devils, huge shout out to Mecha de ASU, and to Chewy in particular, who was the sort of point person that got me through it. Huge shout out to the Heatwave podcast. We'll be releasing my collab with them very shortly. And today you are just going to hear the speech I gave at ASU this past weekend on dialectical materialism, transformation, and liberation, and importantly, what Buddhism and Marxism can say about both, and possibly even learn from each other. So let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and thank you all so much for coming out today. My name is Brett O'Shea, and it is a genuine pleasure and a sincere honor to have been invited invited to ASU to speak on two world historic traditions that have not only long fascinated me, but have been foundational in shaping who I am and how I see the world. These traditions, which we will be talking about today, are, of course, the centuries-long social, political, and economic tradition of Marxism and the millennia-long psychological, spiritual, and even existential tradition of Buddhism. Now, on their face, these two traditions seem to be worlds apart, fundamentally concerned with two totally different terrains of human knowledge and experience, and at times, historically, they have even been at ostensibly direct odds with one another, whether in the tensions between Chinese communists and Tibetan Buddhists, or Japanese Zen practitioners turned kamikaze fighters allied with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union in World War II. But I believe that once we start digging deeper, below the topsoil of recent history and beneath the sediments of cultural distinctions and separate academic fields of study, we can find philosophical overlap and profound synergy between these two traditions. Now let me tell you what I aim to accomplish in this speech. In part one, I intend on briefly outlining the basic ideas and aims of Buddhism and Marxism so as to give you a basic grasp on these two traditions and their implementation. In part two, I want to explore some of the ways in which the seemingly different philosophical outlooks of Marxism and Buddhism overlap and dovetail with one another in surprising and quite profound ways. I will focus primarily on the philosophical framework of dialectical materialism and the ways in which the Buddhist concept of the three poisons can help illuminate the problems within capitalist institutions. In part three, after highlighting the ways in which they are similar, I will touch on some of the ways in which they differ in an attempt to lay out what Buddhism can offer Marxism, as well as what Marxism might offer Buddhism. Finally, in the concluding chapter, I'll put forward the archetype of what I call the Bodhisattva revolutionary, an attempt to show how, through embodying this archetype, we can work toward real liberation via inner and outer transformation. And with that said, let's move into part one, the basics of Buddhism and Marxism. Part one, the aim of Buddhism and Marxism is liberation. I think liberation is a great starting concept for exploring these traditions because both are aimed, very different ways perhaps, at a form of liberation. Let's start with Marxism. Marxism is, of course, a tradition stretching back to the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who lived in Europe during the Industrial Revolution and who developed a world historical and hitherto unmatched apprehension and critique of the capitalist mode of production. 2, a new theory of history and how human societies evolve over time. And 3, an economic and political program aimed at the liberation of humanity from the division of societies into class hierarchies and the exploitation, injustice, inequality, and brutality that class society necessitates. Together, they developed historical materialism, a scientific analysis of history and society and their development over time, which asserts that the institutions and dominant ideologies of a society are an outgrowth of its economic activity, and its economic activity, the way in which humans produce and reproduce the necessities of life, is the primary locus of social organization, influencing or outright determining the other structures in society. They traced human development from ancient and tribal forms of what they called primitive communism up through early slave societies, through feudalism and to capitalism, illustrating how the way in which these societies produced the necessities of life and divided themselves into castes or classes created contradictions that spawned conflict between classes and eventually created the conditions for that mode of production's transcendence and the arrival of a new, more advanced mode of production and set of social relations that itself generated new contradictions that in turn created the conditions for its replacement. In addition to this historical materialism, Marx and Engels began to develop what is now the Marxist philosophical dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism provides the structure for thinking through historical materialism, for generating social analyses, and strategizing movements and organizations dedicated to the transcendence of the current mode of production, namely capitalism. In simple terms, historical materialism is the scientific aspect of Marxism, and dialectical materialism is the philosophical philosophical framework of Marxism. Socialism, according to Marxism, is what we would call the transitionary period between capitalism and Marxism's ultimate goal of communism, a stateless, classless, moneyless society where human beings are no longer stratified into castes or class hierarchies. In the same way that the transition from feudalism to capitalism is often referred to as mercantilism, with features of both the old feudalism as well as the emerging capitalism, socialism is the transition from capitalism to communism, with features of both the old capitalism and the new communism. In summary, Marxism is a scientific approach to history and human social development, a philosophical framework, and a socio-political economic movement aimed at the construction of socialism out of the contradictions present within capitalism, all toward the ultimate goal of a human civilization no longer divided into classes at all. Marxism seeks to liberate humanity from the exploitation, the inequality, the utter irrationality, and the brutal injustices of capitalism. Buddhism, on the other hand, seeks a totally different type of liberation, that of nirvana, or liberation from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth known as the samsara. Buddhism is a tradition going back 2,500 years to the life and teachings of an erstwhile Hindu prince turned spiritual Sikh and ascetic, who, once introduced to the sufferings of the world, sickness, old age, and death, after years of being sheltered from the vicissitudes of life in his palace, left his family and life of luxury in search of deeper truths about the nature of reality, suffering, and the human mind. After years of wandering and fasting and meditating and engaging in all sorts of spiritual practices, finally fed up with all of them, the story goes that he sat underneath a Bodhi tree and refused to get up until he finally knew the mind's true nature. Day in and day out, he sat under the tree and went to war with his own mind, overcoming all forms of struggle, of suffering, of temptation, one by one, until finally he reached what we now call enlightenment and became the awakened one, or the Buddha. After his awakening, he spent the next 40 years before his death walking around the Indian subcontinent, offering his teachings to anyone who was interested. He built a huge following, and upon his death, generated a new world religion, spiritual path, and philosophy. This religion philosophy, known as Buddhism, would migrate out of India and throughout the rest of Asia, morphing and evolving and mixing with the cultures of different societies, eventually producing the beautiful traditions of various schools of Buddhism. The core of Buddhism, however, revolves around the four noble truths. Life is suffering, we suffer because we crave or desire, there is a way out of suffering, and the Eightfold Path is the way out. The Eightfold Path is a set of 8 practices, both ethical and meditative, that, when done correctly and consistently, lead one to enlightenment. In addition to this, Buddhism highlights the 3 marks of existence: impermanence, in Pali pronounced anicca; suffering or unsatisfactoriness, in Pali known as dukkha; and no self, or anatta, and argues that we humans are subject to delusion regarding these 3 intrinsic qualities of our existence, that we try to protect ourselves from them in a myriad of ways and thus escape them, but these attempts just create more suffering. Through meditation practice specifically, and following the Eightfold Path generally, we can come to see the ubiquitous presence of these 3 marks of existence with increasing clarity and liberate ourselves from the immense suffering we create for ourselves by denying or running away from them. In short, Buddhism seeks to liberate human beings from the unnecessary suffering that stems inevitably and inexorably from our constant desiring, our ego delusions, and our desperate clinging and attachment to things that, by their very nature, change and dissolve away. We are always talking to ourselves in our heads. We are always grabbing at pleasure and trying to push pain away. We have this nagging sense of always being not quite satisfied, never quite complete. And so we spend our entire lives leaning forward into the future or backwards into the past, searching for something external to us that will finally make us happy and feel fulfilled, and trying to protect ourselves from all the pain, tragedy, and despair in our lives by building up our psychological defense mechanisms and reifying our sense of separateness. We are always extracting ourselves from the present moment, what is right here and right now, in anticipation for what's coming or in nostalgia for what we once had. We are a mess, and the world is a mess because we are a mess. Buddhism seeks to liberate us from our delusions, our self-inflicted suffering, our desperate clinging and craving, and the faulty idea that we are located somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears, looking out at a world that is not us, and acting as a trembling little commentator to our own lives. To be liberated from all of this is to feel ourselves be completely at home in the world, to be the very cosmos we think is outside of us, to neither cling to pleasures nor run from pain, but to live our lives in the present moment in deep equanimity, and to accept life and death as they come on their terms, with love and compassion and joy in our hearts. So now we see what, at a basic level, these two traditions are all about, and we can see how each one is concerned with a certain type of liberation from certain forms of suffering. And that sets us up quite well for part two, the interesting ways in which these seemingly very different traditions overlap. Part 2, Dialectics and Transformation. It is my contention, which I will defend throughout the rest of this section, that the philosophical framework of dialectical materialism found and developed within the Marxist tradition and summarized above has profound overlap with core Buddhist concepts and with a Buddhist worldview overall. After exploring dialectics, I will turn to an investigation of the three poisons found within Buddhism and attempt to show how these poisons of the individual mind manifest themselves in capitalist institutions and social structures, which in turn create and exacerbate massive suffering for all sentient beings like ourselves. To begin, let me remind you what dialectical materialism is, as it can be a difficult concept for people to wrap their minds around, especially those who are new to the idea. The first thing to say here first, though, briefly, is that Marxism is not a dead doctrine. It is not a dogma, and its core concepts are always being revisited and revised generation after generation. In this respect, it is scientific, meaning it is open-ended, non-dogmatic, experimental, open to new evidence, and in a constant state of evolution itself, advanced by real movements, revolutions as experiments, and the empirical data that they generate. Marxism is not what Marx thought. Marxism is an ever-evolving tradition that Marx and Engels inaugurated through their work, but which is then developed by successive generations of Marxist thinkers and revolutionaries. Marxist concepts, like dialectical materialism, are also subject to debates, differing interpretations, and an evolution in its own right. The philosophical framework of dialectical materialism arose initially out of Marx's study of Hegel, was taken in new directions by Engels, updated and revised by figures like Lenin and Mao, and handed down to us today. Without getting into the nuances and complexities of these differing interpretations, which would take us too far afield, let me just focus on the basics of dialectics. A dialectical approach to the world is one that apprehends all phenomena as fundamentally in motion, as inexorably interconnected and in relationship with all other phenomena, that higher levels of existence are rooted in and emerge from lower levels, that contradictions between phenomena and within phenomena propel their evolution, and that this process of evolutionary advance is governed by laws which are knowable. Friedrich Engels argued that there were at least three basic laws of dialectics. One, the law of unity of opposites, which is the source of development. Two, the law of the passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes, which is the mechanism of development. And three, the negation of the negation, which is the direction, form, and result of the development. Now, this is admittedly quite complex. It can be very confusing to people new to the subject of dialectics. To help understand a bit better, let me use an analogy to Darwinian evolution, which will help bring these concepts to life. Evolution by natural selection is a great example of dialectical materialism. First and foremost, it shows that all life on Earth is in a constant state of evolution and development. Contrary to, say, creationists, who believe God made all the animals and plants as they more or less currently are and put them here on Earth, evolutionary biologists know that this is not true. In reality, life evolves and develops in profound relation to its external environment and is constantly being morphed by natural selection via its relationship to everything else in its ecosystem. So already we can see some basic dialectics at play. Biological life is in a constant state of motion, never static. It is interconnected and literally shaped by its relationship to other life forms as well as its external environment in general. The higher levels of life, say humans for example, are rooted in and emerge from lower levels of life, most recently hominids, then primates, and then mammals generally. And evolution is spurred on by contradictions between an organism and its environment. Penguins losing their ability to fly, a bumblebee's ability to see ultraviolet, humans developing language, a bat's ability to echolocate, the insane speed of gazelles and cheetahs alike. All of these are products of contradictions between the organism and its external environment. Taking the analogy even further, we can see how, for example, small quantitative changes in an organism over time, like genetic mutations and various adaptations, eventually stack up to create a qualitative change in an organism. For example, polar bears and brown bears, or what we usually call grizzly bears, share a common ancestor, and scientists believe that at some point, either by brown bears traveling to the far north or by periods of glaciation, a single species of bear got separated, some going further north and some staying put or going south to warmer climates. The contradiction between these brown bears far up north and the brutally cold, blindingly white environment they found themselves in generated, over long periods of time, the mutations and adaptations, i.e. quantitative changes, that eventually boiled over into qualitative changes, separating the single species into the two distinct species that we know today. The point here is that we can understand the jump from quantitative change, tiny mutations and adaptations over time, piling up to create a qualitative change, in this case, an entirely new species of bear. The materialism part comes in via the fact that no metaphysical or supernatural cause need be referenced. Biological evolution via natural selection is a wholly materialist process. It happens in the natural world and has laws that govern it that we, through scientific investigation, can come to know and understand. In this same way, Marx and Engels argued the evolution of human societies through time is also a materialist process, also has laws that govern its development, and through scientific investigation, we can come to know those laws and understand how they work to produce the social phenomena we see today. Human society is constantly in motion, never static. All the elements of it are deeply interconnected and interact with all other elements. The current mode of production, capitalism, is a higher form of social organization than feudalism, which capitalism is rooted in and evolved out of. And the evolution of human societies over time are propelled by contradictions inherent in them. Today, the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat forces various forms of class conflict that can only be resolved by transcending this division altogether. Moreover, like the law of the unity of opposites tells us, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without the proletariat. They are opposites that necessitate one another, like night and day or up and down. Every class struggle, every attempt to build socialism in the capitalist epoch, every person who consciously embraces socialism and sets themselves the task of helping others learn and apply it, all constitute relatively small quantitative changes that eventually create ruptures and thus the possibility of quantitative change, the change from capitalism to socialism. And just as the capitalist mode of production and its social relations negated the social organization of feudalism, socialism and eventually communism seek to negate the negation, to expropriate the expropriators. But importantly, dialectical negation, in line with the idea that higher forms are rooted in lower forms, does not annihilate the entirety of what it replaces. but brings forward the elements of the old that are still positive and viable, while shedding all those elements of the old that are exhausted, played out, and only serve to hold humanity back. So we should expect, for example, socialism to carry forward those aspects of capitalism that are still viable, while rupturing from all those aspects of it that no longer are, whatever those turn out to be for a given society at a given time in history with a given set of specific conditions. Here we can start to get a grasp on dialectical materialism and how that way of thinking stands in contrast to so much so-called common sense today. For example, when someone says, capitalism is just human nature, or this is just the way things are, or God ordained these hierarchies, ergo they are just, or you are born with the gender and can never change it, or socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried, it simply doesn't work and it never will, or a billion other little platitudes and cliches used by those who are invested in the status quo. When they say such things, they are conveying the idea that the way things are in society today are static, metaphysically ordained, or natural, and thus they are conveying an anti-dialectical way of thinking. You can see why those who think capitalism is the best system, or those who profit from society being organized this way, want us to think that capitalism is here to stay. They want us to think that we have arrived at the pinnacle of socioeconomic organization. And while we might have some tweaking to do around the edges, the basic thing is in place and is here to stay. But dialectically, we understand that capitalism as a mode of production arose out of historical conditions, is in a constant state of flux and development and evolution, and like every single mode of production before it, will also eventually be displaced and transcended, just as it displaced and transcended feudalism. To see capitalism as historically contingent and ephemeral is to grasp dialectical and historical materialism, and you can see rather easily why those invested in maintaining the system are not interested in people thinking in these terms. Just as earlier dogmatic Christians were not very excited to see people start embracing Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection, both capitalists fending off socialists and fundamental Christians fending off Darwinian evolutionists must reject a dialectical way of apprehending the world or risk their relatively cozy spot in the current order. They must put their hands up and scream "stop" in the face of the inexorable march of history. Okay, now that we hopefully have an understanding of dialectical materialism within the Marxist tradition, the question arises, where does Buddhism fit in here? Well, I would argue that core concepts within Buddhism are profoundly dialectical, and that Buddhist philosophy applies a more or less dialectical framework around its entire worldview. The core concepts I want to explore through this lens are the following: no self, otherwise known as emptiness, and dependent origination. To begin, I first want to make clear that both Buddhism and Marxism are process philosophies, meaning they apprehend all phenomena as processes instead of things or objects. Capitalism is an ever-evolving process, as is socialism. The natural world is a process. The cosmos itself is a process. You and I are processes. In both traditions, nothing is static and change is the only constant. This leads to the first concept of Buddhism, no self, or anatta. When people first get into Buddhism and come across this concept, especially those of us in the West where ego is everything, it can seem weird, alien, even downright scary. But fundamentally, the Buddhist concept of no self or emptiness means simply that nothing, including us, has a permanent essence. There is no unchanging, abiding self at the center of our subjective experience. This is quite a radical claim because the feeling of an unchanging self or soul is deeply ingrained within people, especially those of us in the West where no such philosophical analog to no self really exists. But right now, as I speak, I am willing to bet that you feel as if there is a self inside you. Sure, over your life you have changed. 7-year-old you is different mentally, emotionally, and physically than the you sitting and listening to this right now. No one would deny that. But when I ask you what about you has not changed since age 7, what would you say? Well, we feel as if there is a thread running through all our experiences and all the changes in our lives, and this is the me looking out from behind my eyes. Sure, what I see in the mirror changes all the time. My opinions change, my interests change, my clothes and car and job change. But we really feel as if there is something within us that was looking out of the eyes of our 7-year-old selves, out of our 15-year-old selves, and is still looking out of the eyes of our current selves. This is an illusion. The relentlessness of change in the cosmos spares nothing, including you and I. Moreover, we talk to ourselves in our heads all day long, constantly commenting to ourselves, blabbering on about this and that, thinking about something in the past, worrying about something in the future. If you had to go sit in your car right now, totally alone, in silence, what would your mind do? Well, it would start talking to itself. In fact, if I stacked $1 million on this podium and told you that if you could sit in silence and just not think a thought or talk to yourself in your own head for 60 consecutive seconds, you can have this $1 million. I can almost guarantee none of you can do it. The mind is incessant. The mind is like a monkey swinging from tree to tree, thought to thought, babbling to itself. And it's this incessant inner dialogue that we mistake for a separate self. The sense of a real, permanent self inside your skull, looking out of your eyes, is an illusion. It is the product of incessant inner dialogue, of non-stop mental chatter. Every time you think without knowing you are thinking, meaning you're identified with it, every time you talk to yourself in your own head without being fully aware that that's what you're doing, you are reifying the illusion of self. Because the illusion of self is literally generated by thinking without knowing you're thinking. Add on top of this psychological fact, probably a product of evolution and our capacity for language, various cultural ideas, such as the eternal soul from Christianity and the Cartesian dualism between mind and body from Western philosophy, and we all fall prey to the illusion of separateness. The illusion that deep down, behind our eyes and between our ears, is a little, unchanging, permanent self or soul. We say we have a body, not that we are our bodies. That too is a product of having the illusion of a little homunculus behind the control panel in our brains, using the vehicle of the body to move itself around space, but fundamentally separate from it. This trope actually shows up time and time again in our pop culture, in our movies, and in our TV shows. I think of the creature in Men in Black, who was an alien, and when you open up his face, there's a smaller alien sitting at the control panel of his brain. This is perfect Cartesian dualism. And this little fragile, separate self feels monstrously insecure in this world of change and decay and death. The ego, our sense of a separate self, strives to prop up all manner of defense mechanisms to protect itself, to make itself feel safe. It clings to pleasures. It wants to run from pain. It worries about the future. It fixates on the past. It can't fathom its own annihilation or death. This illusion of a permanent self is at the root of every existential crisis. For some, this sense of a separate self is absolutely torturous. For most of us, though, it manifests as a perpetual feeling of not being complete, of not being quite fulfilled, of never quite arriving. In short, this illusion makes us suffer. So Buddhism not only tells us, but shows us how to see for ourselves that this sense of a separate, abiding self at the center of our experience is an illusion, a product of incessant self-talk, and when we build the capacity through meditation to become aware of it, to see how it manifests, and to see all the ways in which this little voice in our heads makes us suffer, when we can place our attention on the breath and keep it there, when the mind calms down and gets real quiet, we can see through the illusion. And when we see through it again and again and again, eventually it gives up the game. It stops being our master and takes its rightful place as our servant. We can pick it up when it's practical to do so, we can set it down when it's not needed. This ability alone alleviates massive amounts of internal suffering, lets us see with extreme clarity the mechanisms of the mind and how they work, and no longer burdens us with the feeling of fundamentally being separate from everything else. We begin to see with astounding beauty and depth how there is no me inside here looking out at the world over there, but there's just the world. And the barrier between subject and object falls away, at least for a time, revealing the profound interconnectedness and non-duality of everything in the cosmos. You feel as if you are no longer placed into the world, only to one day be taken out of it, but rather that you are the world, and the world is you, and there is nothing to be born, there is nothing that dies. Liberating oneself from this illusion is a core feature of enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition, and it radically reorients your entire moment-to-moment experience of your own existence in a profoundly beneficial and healing way. But emptiness is not just about the self or ego. It's the claim that nothing in the universe has any abiding essence. Everything is flux. Everything is a cascade of relentless change. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is a static thing or object. We are all just temporary whirlwinds of atoms coming together for a time as this process I call me, and then dissolving away, coming together with different atoms to form another temporary process, and on and on and on. To cling to the idea of a stable, permanent me, in this context, is to suffer enormously. The atoms in our bodies were forged inside stars, have been at the bottom of the ocean, passed through dinosaurs, and have come together here and now to form us. All of the cosmos, based on the latest science, can be traced back to an infinitely small and dense single point of origin, meaning we all literally are one with everything in the universe, and the Big Bang expelled everything outward into space and time to dance and play and swirl, taking on infinite forms. Science, in some respect, is just catching up with ideas that Buddhists put forward 2 millennia before the invention of the scientific method itself. It's quite astounding when you sit back and think about it. In any case, this concept of no self or emptiness in Buddhism not only fits perfectly with phenomena as processes, but with dialectics itself. Everything is in flux. Everything is intimately interconnected with everything around it. There are no things and no one who stands outside the flux. Nothing is permanent or fixed. Everything is in a constant state of development and transformation, and nothing supernatural or metaphysical need be advanced to explain material reality. On this last point, there are certainly forms of Buddhism and many Buddhists who do not subscribe to materialism, and there can be dialectical philosophies that are neither ontologically materialist, as in Marxism, or idealist, as in Hegelianism, as well as ones that remain agnostic or neutral with regards to what is primary, known in philosophy as monism. But none of this subtracts from the idea that the concept of emptiness and no self is perfectly in line with a dialectical apprehension of the world, and that one need not resort to non-materialist explanations of this reality, though some may choose to do so. Now let's move on to the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, or dependent arising. In simple terms, this means that everything in the cosmos is dependent on other things for their existence. The late Vietnamese Zen Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh was great at giving examples of this. Let's take his example of the flower. When you hold a flower in your hand, you have a concept for it and a word that sits in for the thing you're holding. We understand it at first as a static object. But dig a little deeper and we can see its interconnectedness with the entire universe. Try to imagine that flower without the soil from which it sprang, without the sun which helped it grow and allows you to see it with your eyes, or without the rain which watered and nourished it. Another easy example would be something like a peach. When you bite into a peach, there's a sense in which you are biting into the whole world, for innumerable conditions and factors had to come together to produce this fruit, as well as the sensation you get when biting into it. We can zoom out a bit and use ourselves as examples. The iron in our blood came from exploding stars billions of years ago. The water in our blood used to be one with the ocean. The breath we breathe is utterly dependent on plants and trees across the globe. In a real sense, plant life is as essential for our own existence as our lungs are. The sun is as essential for our own existence as our own beating hearts are. The moon stabilizes Earth's orbit, making it habitable for relatively advanced creatures such as ourselves. Without it, there would be no us. In this way, we are profoundly, deeply dependent on everything else around us and everything else in the cosmos for our own existence. Now, we can also apply this idea to politics. The billionaire is not, as we are often told, a rugged individualist who, through grit and hard work, built his empire and is a self-made man. Rather, he is utterly dependent on scores of working and poor people to generate even a single fucking dollar. Put a billionaire on a deserted island, and he is nothing. Everything we value, from schools to hospitals to roads to air conditioning, are all the products of countless people working over huge swaths of time, stretching back generations. All are dependent upon a variety of factors and conditions coming together to create them. All wealth in the world is the product of centuries of human toil, of which all of our ancestors contributed. Yet today, all of that wealth is stolen and hoarded by a tiny amount of people who claim it's rightfully theirs and not ours. The entire capitalist paradigm and the hyper-individualism that it necessitates is built on the rejection of the idea of dependent origination. It is built on a delusion. Similar arguments of this type could be made for other core concepts within Buddhism, including impermanence, non-duality, and many more. But here we can see how an idea that is central to Buddhism is intrinsically dialectical and can usefully be applied to socio-economics and politics in a way that directly undermines, instead of bolsters, the capitalist mode of production and its ideological superstructure. On the other hand, the core orientation of socialism and communism is perfectly in line with the concept of dependent origination, because we understand that everything we have is the product of countless people's labor, as well as the product of our relationship with the natural world. We understand how cooperation is essential, how solidarity with others can massively benefit ourselves, and how we are ultimately dependent on one another. There is no me in a vacuum, and there is no you in a void. We are products of the human species, we are products of planet Earth, and we are products of the entire fabric of the cosmos itself. We are literally, and I mean this literally, the cosmos becoming conscious. We, like all sentient beings across the universe, are literally the entire cosmos waking up here and now in this form from this standpoint. We understand the deep underlying interconnectedness of human civilization and of the world in which we live, and our politics, at its best, honors that interconnectedness and centers it as essential. I hope thus far I have made it quite clear why this dialectical way of approaching and apprehending the world is not only correct, but a real threat to the status quo, to the ruling elite and their ideology, and to the capitalist mode of production itself. This is why Marxism, dialectical materialism, and ideas like no self and dependent origination must remain fringe and must be undermined. We are simply not taught to think this way, and for rather obvious reasons. One more area of philosophical overlap I want to touch on before moving forward is the concept of the three poisons of Buddhism. These three poisons are greed, ill will, and delusion. When they are present in the mind, and when one is identified with them, they wreak havoc on an individual's psyche, bolster the ego delusion, and create suffering for all involved. And while Buddhism talks about this almost exclusively in terms of the individual mind, I think it's quite natural to argue that if most people are susceptible to these three poisons, they can be instantiated not just at the individual psychological level, but also on the collective socio-political level. And it is my argument that capitalism, in many ways, institutionalizes these three poisons, attempts to naturalize them, and then exacerbates their intensity on the individual and collective levels. What, for example, is capitalist profiteering and exploitation if not unbridled greed presented as natural and good? What is imperialism, colonialism, and fascism, all manifestations of capitalism, if not institutionalized and structural ill will, connected, of course, with the inherent greed of capitalism and its incentive structures? What is capitalist ideology, if not hegemonic delusion? On every level, it seems that these three poisons which Buddhism identifies are taken to their structural and institutional extremes within capitalism. Moreover, if Buddhism is correct in arguing these three poisons are prevalent in the unenlightened human mind, it stands to reason that putting millions of humans together might take these individual psychological traits and turn them into collective institutions. And this is an insight derived precisely from investigating the ways in which Buddhism and Marxism dovetail and overlap. Buddhism, by illuminating certain truths about how the human mind works, can offer Marxism useful concepts that can be applied to society as a whole. Marxism is, after all, not focused on individuals and their minds, and there are things to learn about individual psychology and the machinations of the human mind that are illuminating and helpful to a broader social analysis and critique. In this way, these two traditions, focusing on opposite ends of the individual versus collective spectrum, can be brought together to deepen already existing insights, as well as generate new ones. What I am doing here is hardly exhaustive on this front. Rather, it's more akin to a first pass, in the hopes that Buddhists might take an interest in Marxism, that Marxists might take an interest in Buddhism, and that more connections and useful synergies might be discovered and utilized to work toward the shared goal of ending suffering and pursuing liberation. Part 3. What can Marxism and Buddhism offer one another? Now that we have discussed what Marxism and Buddhism are, as well as some of the ways in which their basic dialectical approach to the world overlaps and can even deepen one another, I want to touch on some concrete things that each tradition might be able to offer the other one. To keep it simple and concise, I believe that what Buddhism can offer Marxism is an inroad to a form of dialectical analysis of the individual, their mind, and its mechanisms. Marxism is not fundamentally concerned with these things, but as good dialecticians, we understand there is a profoundly important dialectical relationship between inner and outer, between the individual and the collective, between psychology and ideology. As such, it can only benefit us Marxists to take that side of the coin, as it were, seriously, particularly in the context of political education, organizing, meeting people where they are, and, importantly, constructing healthy, non-toxic activist spaces and organizations. And this is important because if any of you have had the experience of visiting Marxist internet subcultures or even many organizations, I am sure you've noticed there tends to be a lot of ego. Marxists tend to be intellectual types, and without a sort of psychological ballast and ethical structure offered by things like Buddhism, those egos swell to sometimes insane proportions. People want to be right more than they want to be effective. Entire organizations doing good work will split up and disintegrate based on members' inability to navigate interpersonal conflict, or because of the fixation on minor disagreements that are irrelevant to the current struggle. Buddhism offers an ethical structure and behavioral guidelines that Marxism often lacks, and they can be applied in a secular way if needed. For example, while some of the 8 principles in the Eightfold Path are fundamentally about Buddhist meditation, right mindfulness, and right concentration, for example, the vast majority of them can be applied to anyone from any religious, spiritual, or cultural background, which is different from something like the 10 Commandments in Christianity, for example. Right intention, right speech, right action, right effort, right view, and right livelihood are all fully applicable within the context of a socialist organization or cadre. They are ready-made ethical guidelines with millennia of history that not only help create a healthier organizational culture and healthier individuals, but are also fundamental to the sort of awakening process within Buddhism that, while not necessary for Marxists, could only be a positive thing if pursued. In summary, Buddhism offers up an analysis of individual psychology, a universally applicable ethical structure, a systematic way of addressing egoism in ourselves and our comrades, and can help us relate better to ourselves as well as others in our community and beyond. On the flip side, we must ask, what can Marxism offer Buddhism? Well, I would argue that it would be something like the systematic scientific analysis of social, economic, and political phenomena, which is the outward collective application of the systematic and scientifically rigorous analysis of psychological and emotional phenomena that Buddhism already excels at. In addition, Marxism offers a political methodology for overcoming institutionalized and structural forms of the three poisons. Buddhists will often talk about healing the world by healing oneself. And while I find that to be useful and even true, I don't find it to be sufficient. We do not have the time to sit around and wait for enough people to get into Buddhism and become enlightened to make the sort of collective change that is so desperately needed. With climate change, the risk of nuclear war, the rapid advancement of society-shaking technologies that under capitalism become mechanisms of further destitution and unemployment and misery, the many ongoing imperialist conflicts, the rise of neo-fascist authoritarianism around the world, and many more crises piling up every single day, we simply do not have the luxury of waiting for everyone to do the necessary individual work required to reform human civilization. That can only be done through international, organized, and revolutionary political movements with a totally different vision for the world. While socially engaged forms of Buddhism do exist, they often default to the liberal center and to weak forms of reformism. Defaulting to lukewarm liberal activism does literally nothing to move the needle in the direction it needs to be moved. And since it is liberal, it seeks not to create a different world, but to reify and replicate the very ideological hegemony that keeps things as they are, often without knowing that that's what they're doing. And this is because liberalism is the dominant ideology of capitalism itself. They go hand in hand. If Buddhists are serious about alleviating suffering, then they have to take politics seriously. And if Marxists are serious about becoming the sort of people that are capable of creating a truly new and better world, they need to take the inner work that traditions like Buddhism offer seriously. Conclusion. The Bodhisattva Revolution. Today, I have argued that Marxism can benefit from a sincere engagement with Buddhism, and Buddhism, in turn, can benefit from a sincere engagement with Marxism. I hope I have outlined effectively the primary goals of each tradition, the ways in which their philosophical orientations share a deeply dialectical lens, and the ways in which each tradition could benefit and possibly deepen the other. To end, I want to leave you with an image, an archetype, if you will, that synthesizes everything I've said here today into a template that each of us, insofar as we are more or less convinced of what I've been arguing for, can adopt and strive to fulfill. This archetype is what I call the Bodhisattva Revolutionary. We all know what a revolutionary is. It is someone committed to confronting the injustice and inequality and suffering that are ubiquitous in class society and working to build a better, more just, more equitable, egalitarian world. The revolutionary is selfless, dedicated to the people, and shaking with indignation at every injustice. Figures like Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara, Rosa Luxemburg, and many others jump to mind. All of these people mentioned were also willing to pay the ultimate price for their vision of a better world. All three of them were brutally murdered by agents of the status quo, of capitalism, of fascism, and of imperialism. Their images are seared into our brains, and we strive to contribute even a fraction of what they did to the project of building a better world. Now we must combine that with the image of the Bodhisattva, that figure within Mahayana Buddhism who, in one telling, is an already enlightened being who, out of pure loving compassion for other sentient beings, remains in the cycle of samsara and forgoes nirvana simply in order to save others. That version might be too ideal for many of us who are anything but enlightened, and of course I count myself among the unenlightened. The other version of the Bodhisattva is a little more realistic. It is someone who is on the path towards Buddhahood, and who commits themselves to dedicating their entire life and meditative practice and their whole being to the alleviation of suffering in others. The Bodhisattva is selfless in an even deeper sense than the revolutionary, because she seeks to actively dismantle the illusion of a separate self and uses the insight gained from that endeavor to better understand and thus help other sentient beings. Bodhisattvas set for themselves the impossible task, the consciously impossible task, of ending all suffering and helping all beings to awaken. They vow not to enter nirvana themselves until all beings can enter it together, hand in hand. That's real solidarity. By combining these archetypes, one Marxist, one Buddhist, we can create for ourselves a well-balanced ideal to strive for. Instead of dedicating our lives to careerism, the accumulation of wealth, and the pursuit of high status within the capitalist framework, as we are trained to do, we reject all of that and dedicate our lives instead to alleviating the suffering of other beings, confronting courageously the forces of oppression and hate and greed, and toppling structures of domination and exploitation and suffering in order to build an egalitarian civilization rooted in interconnectedness, justice, truth, beauty, and solidarity. A world where no one sleeps in the gutters. A world where no one goes without health care or food. A world in which no one goes without an education. And a world where no one suffers in totally avoidable and unnecessary ways so that others may live lives of extreme opulence. Let us all strive to embody within ourselves the Bodhisattva revolutionary ideal.
There are many books, many essays, many YouTube videos about Marxist critiques of Christianity. The liberation theology branch of Christianity hoped to reinvigorate Christianity with its social justice mission that, according to those writers, was actually at the core of Jesus' teaching. And of course, many of the political movements based around socialism and communism in the past have harbored a deep negativity towards Christianity in particular. However, Buddhism seems to go largely unnoticed by these critiques. The idea of a slave morality put forward by Nietzsche, the idea that religious systems tended to be popular amongst slaves in comforting slaves as an anesthetic for slaves, and as a philosophy that slaves would encourage other slaves to adopt, seems to be mainly talked about with reference to Christianity and less so with Buddhism. Although, interestingly, Buddhism generally doesn't really, I suppose, tell people to comply with their slavery or wage slavery, but instead retreat to monasteries. That seems to be much more of a big thing in Buddhism. However, a monastery is marked by material deprivation, by a kind of celebration of poverty that a Marxist might find interesting. Someone who views history through the eyes of historical materialism might take quite a dim view of Buddhism. In fact, I remember once watching a video about, it was a Chinese propaganda video about why they were invading Tibet, and their basic argument was, look at these poor fools. They spend all of their time in absolute poverty, eating nothing but goat milk and rice gruel, meditating all day, owning nothing, and we, the communists, are going to go and liberate them from their poverty and make them more wealthy. That's interesting. Very interesting. In Laos, it unfolded very differently. I went to Laos. I've been to Southeast Asia. I love traveling in those countries. And whilst in countries like Cambodia, the Buddhists got basically genocided, all of the Buddhist monks pretty much killed by Pol Pot and his regime, his murderous regime. In Laos, something quite interesting happened. The communists showed up and they looked at the Buddhist monks and they said, hang on a minute, aren't you guys kind of already communists? I mean, you live in communes for a start. You don't really have private property and ownership. You're generally kind of an egalitarian thing. You monks tend to treat one another as equals. those guys with the fancy hats over there, we'll have to do something about them, the abbots and the Buddhist leaders and this kind of thing. We'll sort them out. But maybe the Buddhists and the communists can get along, actually. And lo and behold, they kind of did. Although, you know, in Laos, I think the Buddhists became a part of the social services system, in a way, a part of the welfare system to some extent. They helped to provide education and medicine and do the community bureaucracy a little bit. And one might argue that the slightly less Buddhist as a result. One could argue that the purity of the monastic escape that is previously associated with Buddhism has been somewhat depleted. I think there is a bit of an issue with Buddhism because it puts and poverty and inequality, because it puts the entire onus of suffering on the individual for the most part. It doesn't really at all talk about social conditions that give rise to suffering. Indeed, social conditions, being simply conditions, would never be suitable as a permanent source of satisfaction, according to a Buddhist. Just as in Christianity, the people are told, don't worry about your rich master, he's gonna go to hell. In Buddhism, people are told, don't worry about your rich and nasty master, he will be reincarnated in some negative form, perhaps as an animal, perhaps as a lesser human or something like this. So both Christianity and Buddhism in various forms do spin certain yarns designed to reduce the resentment and anger people feel towards those who have more power than they do. So, you know, Buddhism could be beaten with that same stick, I suppose, as Christianity has been. I suppose also you could argue that Buddhism is just another opiate of the masses. After all, a person could go to the ruler and say, or even the Lama, let's say Tibetan, hang on a second, you lamas are flying around in private jets and you're surrounded by golden statues, and the goat herders in the mountains are meant to be donating money to you, even though you kind of do nothing. I mean, meditating all day is good for people. It might make people more moral, but a lot of your time is spent not herding goats or tilling the soil, like we have to do. And then the lamas could just say, you just need to go and meditate more. If you meditate more, you'll see that this isn't a real problem. The suffering you're experiencing is caused by your lack of self-discipline over your thoughts, and you just need to change the way you're thinking. Well, I don't think that is particularly satisfying for our Marxist critique. I suppose, though, one of the problems with this opiate of the masses line is that basically just about anything other than revolution could be called an opiate of the masses. Television is the opiate of the masses. Facebook is the opiate of the masses. Reading a book is the opiate of the masses. Anything that isn't actually toppling the bourgeoisie can be labelled as simply a pacifying distraction from the really important task of toppling the bourgeoisie. So I don't know if that critique is quite so watertight. But anyway, I think it's important. I mean, I love Buddhism and I love many of the teachings, but I think it's important to be critical of it. I think it's important to bring these Marxist critiques to Buddhism and ask the extent to which both the teachings and the practices of Buddhism, to some extent, actually kind of comply with the status quo and perhaps even help maintain it. That leads me to a rather bleak and dark view of Buddhist monasticism. When you look at Southeast Asian countries, you look at the history of them, often the people in power had many women. I remember visiting, what's that place called? Yes, Hue in Vietnam, and reading about the emperor, and he would have women brought from all over the country on a weekly basis, fresh virgins to service his phallus on a weekly basis. Presumably, for each one of the virgins he would get through there and who would join his harem, there would be some man who was left without a woman. What could we do about that? Well, maybe we should make a place, like a monastery or something, where we send those men and we teach them to be at peace with their lack of pussy in their lives. Yeah, that'll do. We'll just get them to meditate enough on it and teach them that removing their desire, largely for women actually, is essential to peace and enlightenment. Well, it's certainly essential to peace and enlightenment if all of the women have been shipped off to the emperor and there aren't any left for you. Certainly then you don't have too much choice but to meditate, or God forbid, hook up with someone of your own sex, or forbid that, whatever. Yeah, so, you could argue that monasteries themselves are a part of a social system that is precisely designed to maintain the real privileges of the men at the top, because of course most of the people going into monasteries were men. That's the other thing. They didn't really feel the need to send women to monasteries. But now, of course, we also have a situation where a lot of men are not getting laid. We don't have monasteries to send them to brainwash them into feeling that that's a completely fine thing. And I wonder if there's a thing there. If the rulers knew that these guys, from a certain point of view, the monasteries were potentially kind of suckers on that front. When you have a whole social system designed to channel a large portion of men into the army and a large portion of men into monasteries, well, that's going to really basically devalue women in the sexual marketplace and leave a lot of women for the rulers at the top, who, funnily enough, don't need to be in the army or a monastery, to basically have to themselves. So, the bitter, cynical, pessimistic part of me does sometimes wonder if Buddhist monasteries served a certain function like that. God, this video is all over the place, isn't it? Really not one topic, but a whole load of ideas. I suppose I'm going to throw one more in there. I mean, as some of you know, I love monasteries. I've stayed in monasteries, and I think monasteries are actually really useful on both a personal and a social level. But I think a great deal about the way in which human beings create social systems influence how genes have been selected. The selection of our genes through social processes and institutions, a kind of self-domestication process, essentially. How, for example, does the existence of prisons or mental asylums influence the genes that make it through to the next generation? And it seems to me that these institutions, when enough people engage with them, have a kind of slightly eugenic effect. There is an unconscious genetic selection, or I think unconscious, I would hope unconscious, genetic selection process that unfolds through them. Well, this points to something kind of disastrous about monasteries, because we have to wonder what kind of people are drawn to monastic living. Well, on the surface, we might say that the people drawn to Buddhist monasticism historically were potentially the people most concerned with truth and morality and cultivating virtue and things like that. And in theory, there might be a genetic correlation towards these dispositions, just as there might be a genetic correlation to being a greedy, selfish psychopath who loves to deceive and lie to people on the other side of it. So, potentially, the long history of monasteries over the last 2,000 years or so has actually constituted a disaster when it comes to human genetics. We've been almost systematically removing the best from the gene pool. And monks were often the most literate and intelligent people in a society as well. So we've basically been removing the most literate, most virtuous, and most truth-seeking individuals through the monastic system, which of course insists on celibacy, insists on those who engage with it not passing their genes on. The people who pass their genes on, for the most part, have been the serfs who actually sponsor these celibate monasteries. So, it's worth considering the impact that monasteries have had on human genetics. Anyway, this rambling video is now coming to a close, so thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found some of those many topics interesting.
My name is Ember Kelly. I am the Director of Religious Education at the Universal Society. I use she and her pronouns. It's so good to be here with you all tonight, and I'm so excited for the second in our currently four, possibly adding a fifth even, but the second of four religion and socialism speakers as part of a speaker series we're doing here at the Fourth Universalist Society. So have you here, and I just want to promo our upcoming. Upcoming we have next week, same time, same place, organizing as Practical Theology with Ben Haney, and then a few weeks from now, same time, same place, Loneliness, Capitalism, and Religion with Rafael Diaz. And since you are here, I'm assuming you already did the sign up and knew how to get there, but FFU.org/socialism, where we will also keep a recording of these talks. We already have Talia's from last week about futures of religion and socialism is on there as well. So I am so excited for tonight's event, for thinking about Buddhism and socialism with Ravi Talati, and I am just excited to learn. This is not an intersection of religion and socialism that I know really anything about, so I am excited to be here to learn as much as I am to moderate and administrate. And so, Ravi, I will hand it over to you.
Brilliant, yeah, I just want to say it's a real honor to be invited to speak today. As you can tell, I mean, it's midnight here in the UK, so you can tell I'm passionate about this. It's one of these things that really interests me, obviously, as someone who is a socialist and who is religious, the intersections of socialism and religion, but there's not many, I've come across a lot of religious socialists, but it's not something that I see talked about much, so I'm really happy that this is happening. I've got a little presentation as well, so I'm just going to share my screen. Right, so I'll just a little bit about myself, just so you're all know a little bit about me. I'm from Manchester in England, best city on the planet, in my opinion. I know a lot of you will be New Yorkers and probably quite passionate about your city, but I'm afraid Manchester is the greatest city on the planet. By trade, I'm a software engineer. Please don't ask me about your IT problems, like not that kind of person. I am on a bit of a break at the moment, but I am also quite politically active in my spare time. Have been for a lot of my 20s, and I'm going to talk a lot about that in a second. I would call myself a communist, so there's a little bit of debate among socialists, what terms do we have, and lots of people have different opinions. I prefer the term communist just because, Marxist works as well, but I think Marx wouldn't have really enjoyed the term Marxist. I think, he always said that ideas, philosophy come from people, from the masses. I think communism is a much more accurate way to describe something. I mean, you wouldn't call a biologist a Darwinist or a physicist a Newtonist. So to me, I prefer the term communist. I'm not a very good one, but I am a Buddhist. I've very recently sort of converted about 2 years ago. Did my formal refuge ceremony last year, and even though I don't meditate as much as I should, I am very passionate about Buddhism and its philosophy, and I enjoy talking about it as much as I can. And in my spare time, I'm also constantly sort of studying other religions, learning about theology, history. Very, very casually. I'm not an expert or an academic or anything like that. I just thought I'd add on the end, if the beanie and the scraggly writing on my shirt. Didn't give it away. I'm a metalhead as well. Big into heavy metal. So yeah, do hit me up if you are as well. I definitely could talk a lot about the overlap between Buddhism and heavy metal. So to start off with, just to give you a rundown, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself first. I know that I will talk about Buddhism and socialism for a little bit, but I just wanted to give some background when I start talking about my ideas later on, so you've got an idea of my experiences and why I've come to the conclusion that I have. So my history as a socialist, a communist, whatever you want to call it. When I was a kid, wasn't that politically minded. I mean, most kids aren't. I'm quite surprised, though, having come across a few, worked with a few socialist youth organisations. I'm surprised at how increasingly left-wing a lot of teenagers are these days, but at the time I didn't really know much about politics, but my parents were very politically minded. I'd say they're quite liberal, always voted Labour, always had very strong opinions and always made sure to educate me on politics and explain things to me. My mum especially, gave me a really good sense of sort of justice and fairness, and I think that contributed a lot to, me becoming a socialist later on. And of course, I would then live through 9/11 and the new Labour government, and I was actually born a Muslim. I was raised Muslim, so 9/11 especially had a big impact on me, and I started really showing me sort of the aspects of racism in front of me in real time, and sort of imperialism as well. Imperialism has always been something that's I've been quite aware of. Going on to school, I would then learn about the USSR, Palestine and Ireland, and that really helped develop me politically. Especially the USSR. I mean, I was suddenly hearing about this situation where, workers who had been oppressed for ages, basically set up their own sort of self-governance and, overthrew the government, and it gave me this idea, started to give me this idea that, there are other systems of governance out there. And I was learning about Ireland and Palestine. Ironically, the module was on terrorism, but it made me very sympathetic to their struggles, actually, because these people were trying to reclaim their countries, basically their homelands. So suddenly I was learning a lot more about imperialism and the role it played in politics, and especially the Irish. And to this day, the Irish struggle is definitely something I'm very, very sympathetic to. But I wouldn't say I was still. I wouldn't say I was a socialist at this time. I didn't really know much. In fact, actually, around about the age of 16, I considered myself a Liberal Democrat, as in the Liberal Democrat Party. But that was just because I really didn't like New Labour. I knew I didn't like Labour, because I didn't like New Labour, didn't like Blair, didn't like Gordon Brown. And Liberal Democrats were the only sort of alternative I knew. So I went on this way for quite a while. Went through uni. I'd come across a few left-wingers and stuff, but I didn't really have any strong opinions. And then Brexit happened, and I think Brexit was a big turning point in a lot of young people's lives here. Funnily enough, I voted Remain, but I would say I'm actually now on the opposite side of the fence. I'm pro-Brexit, but Brexit really is where I started to lose faith in the sort of current system of governance and started to look for alternatives. The debate was just awful on both sides. Basically had the choice between sort of the existing neoliberal system, which just expected us to vote for it just because, and then the Brexit side, which was full of, anti-immigration, nationalism, just a lot of toxicity, and the sort of result of Brexit, the increase in sort of attacks on immigrants and things like that. Just I knew that something was really, really wrong, and at this point, this is when I started to look into alternatives, and that's when I came across the Communist Manifesto. I know there's a lot of Marxists out there who don't recommend it as a beginner's book for some reason, but I really rate it. I think it's a fantastic piece of literature, and for me, it was a huge turning point. I mean, as I read through it, I was like, this is all correct. The world is made of two classes. There is an oppressive. It all made sense, and history does work like that. History makes so much more sense when you talk about class struggle. So this is when I started to looking into socialist theory and things like that. I think for quite a while, I thought myself as an anarchist for a while, but I started to read a bit more, and I do like some anarchist texts. I definitely like Kropotkin, for example. But I'd definitely say I'm a Marxist. Definitely, I read a lot of Lenin at that point, State and Revolution particularly. So that really brought me to being more of a sort of more Marxist side of things. So of course, at that point, I was like, I've read all this theory. What do I do? So since then, I've worked with a few socialist organisations, worked with a few anti-austerity campaigns, specifically worked with trade unions, and done a little bit of sort of anti-fascist work as well. And the trade unions and the socialist organisations, this was the first time I would meet other workers, face to face, have proper political conversations, and that really helped develop my political opinions that I have today. The trade union work, especially, I've learned so much from that, and learning, that really it's not all so glamorous. Socialism is it's not all red flags and storming, Parliament or storming, government buildings. It's a lot of admin work, and it can be quite boring at times, quite tedious. A lot of meetings and voting. It was a really, really good experience. I've learned a lot from it. So I am currently on a break a little bit, but I am looking to join again, start getting back involved again this year. Probably hoping to maybe try and get some more organisation happening within sort of sphere of software engineering and things like that, which there is a real lack of. So anyway, enough about the socialism. I'll talk a little bit about why I converted to Buddhism. Now, there's a lot less to talk about here because I have only just recently converted, but it has been a path that's taken a long time. So, like I said earlier, I was raised Muslim, but both of my parents were never that interested. My mum was raised Christian, and she was. My mum's English, by the way. I'm mixed race, so she was raised Christian. My dad was raised Muslim. Mum went through a small phase when she was about 18, 19, but she was quite interested in sort of different sects of Christianity. But I think she joined the Methodist Church for a while, but eventually sort of became disillusioned with it. My dad, he was only really into Islam because of the community aspects, and he left that afterwards. So they were quite critical of religion. So as a result, I never really engaged with it much. And my experience, I think a lot of people who are religious might relate to this. the experience of sort of religion being kind of like a bunch of rules that are enforced on you and not much else. And you know, at that point, you sort of you don't you end up being quite critical of it. I think a lot of people are. So you know, when I was a teenager, I sort of said I don't really identify as Muslim anymore. I don't really want anything to do with it. You know, from there on, I would say I was an atheist. But towards sort of my early 20s, I dealt with a lot of mental illness, you know, issues with depression, and Marxism helped a lot with that. You know, it's sort of the Marxist philosophy. You know, it's you know, very optimistic philosophy, but still, you know, I think Marxism can lack answers to more fundamental questions of things like why are we here? You know, what's the purpose of you know, humanity? You know, what's the ideal way of living? It does touch upon it sometimes, but you know, ultimately, obviously, socialist theory is based on socialism and you know, political structures and you know, the next stage of human history. So doesn't have much to say about these things. You know, so I knew I had this longing for some form of spirituality or some form of guiding path. So I began researching, you know, in my spare time, and I researched. I considered everything from, you know, Catholicism, the Quakers, Islam again, Judaism. I went into the occult. You know, I studied a little bit of the occult. Got into Satanism a little bit, which I know might make some people laugh because it's quite the opposite of Marxism. But you know, that's really the reason I struggled a lot with it, because you know, it's quite an individualistic religion. So yeah, I had a lot of difficulties because I, you know, very strongly held these Marxist beliefs, but a lot of religions do clash a little bit, or at least on the surface they seem to clash with Marxism. So yeah, so I was finding it hard to reconcile a lot of religious philosophy. I think the issue with a lot of religious philosophy, and it's not wholly true, but I feel like there's a lot of when you first engage with it, it starts off with a lot of with the concept of God, or some sort of, you know, what I'd say is more idealistic stage of philosophy, is in, you know, the philosophical school of idealism, and you know, it sort of takes it, you know, it presents it as being sort of true from a from a starting point. So I was already struggling with that, you know, because I didn't really believe in God at that time. But yeah, eventually I came across a book on Tantra, the you know, ancient Buddhist Hindu system of spirituality. Specifically, it's a really good book called Agora. I do recommend it to anyone who's interested in Indian religion. It's the life of an Aghori from India, and he did touch on Buddhism a little bit. So I thought, I didn't realise, you know, there was such a thing as tantric Buddhism, and I didn't realise I didn't know much about Buddhism. I hadn't, you know, all I knew about Buddhism at the time was fasting monks, and I didn't really have much of an opinion. And then I started looking into it, and I was amazed, you know, what Buddhist philosophy was. You know, it's very, very different to what I imagined it to be. It's first of all, how much of it aligned with my views at the time, and it's very. I don't want to say other religions aren't rational and logical, because they are. There's been loads of rational philosophy, especially in like Christianity, but it is, you know, from the surface level. As soon as you engage with it, it's very concrete. It's very rational, very logical. Works from the ground up. You know, it says, you know, the Buddha, you know, specifically worked from what you could already know and verify, right now in front of you, and then works from there. And so I was like, so I'm reading up about dependent origination. I'm like, yes, this makes sense, because of course the world does it's obvious. We know now that, say, the human body is made up of cells, which are made up of proteins, which are made up of atoms. Of course, yeah, that does make sense. And and even and then that led to like reincarnation making sense to me. The other thing is, Buddhism is not really, I think, very similarly to Marxism, it's not really focused on metaphysics. I mean, it does exist, the Buddha and Buddhist thought does have strong opinions on metaphysics, but it's mainly focused on what you can do practically to end your suffering and the suffering of others. And it gives you a lot of practical advice on, how to make your life better through meditation, through mindfulness. And that's worked for me. I was already dealing with mental illness. I was already practicing some forms of mindfulness. I was already practicing meditation at the time, so I already knew this stuff worked, and Buddhism just sort of helped with that. I just want to stress again, I don't think Buddhism is like better than any other religion. I'm just particularly passionate about it. That's why I talk about it so great. I strongly believe, whatever religion you follow is the right one for you, and all religions, have good and truth in them, and really encourage everyone to follow what they feel best. But if that if you enjoy sort of that sort of thing, that rationality and the logical side of philosophy, then Buddhism makes a lot of sense. So spoiler. So just talk a little bit about the history of Buddhism and socialism. I just want to say I'm not an expert on these things. I did a lot of the research when I was coming up with the presentation for this. I'm not an academic, but it is interesting. Definitely, please look into it. First thing I want to say is that I don't believe any religion is inherently any kind of follows any sort of politics. There's no sort of inherently socialistic. You can find socialistic aspects in a lot of religions, and all forms of politics. Have used religion to push certain agendas, certain goals. Buddhism has been used both for sort of liberal movements. It's definitely been used for fascist movements. We know about Japan and the issues, the genocides on the Rohingya Muslims, which are a real shame, and I'd completely condemn. So I'm not going to say that Buddhism is inherently socialistic, but it is interesting at the sort of history behind the relationship and of socialism and Buddhism, because it has overlapped more than you would expect. However, unfortunately, it has, for most of socialist history, Buddhists and socialists have been, have clashed a lot. I think a lot of socialists have been anti-religion, especially in the past, and it makes sense because this was in times when religion was often very much tied in with the government. Socialists across Europe were very critical of the church, for example. So it makes sense that socialists in the East would also be very critical of Buddhist institutions who might have been in line with the government. So it was definitely seen as sort of a sign of an outdated view of culture, which a lot of these socialist movements in the East want to get rid of. However, it's also interesting to know that with a lot of the anti-colonial movements you'd find in East Asia, Southeast Asia, you would find a lot of occasionally Buddhist and socialist syntheses, mainly because sometimes because Buddhism was seen as kind of like an indigenous religion. Maybe it was tied in with sort of the national culture which people wanted to preserve. You know, they might be using it as a sort of like, look, Buddhism's more naturally, you know, works with our you know, anti-colonial our independence movement, as opposed to something like Christianity, which was often seen as the religion of colonizers, or a foreign religion. So there were, you know, these cases where Buddhists and socialists, you know, did come together. So yeah, so I've got a few you can see on the background there. Yes, that is the Dalai Lama, His Holiness. We've also got Han Yong-un and Ambedkar, who's a particular interest of mine. First, I'm going to talk about Gendon Pelgidin. I might be saying that wrong, but he was the first president. So I think he's the first case of where you would have Buddhism and socialism start to come together. And he was the first president of the Mongolian People's Republic, and he was a staunch Buddhist himself. Ultimately, he would get purged in the 30s after being asked by the Soviet government to liquidate Buddhist institutions at the time, which he fought against. So he would be replaced from office and then unfortunately executed in the purges. However, you know, he was quoted as saying that he said that I think Lenin and Buddha were some of the greatest geniuses in history. So, you know, he definitely held both in high esteem. I think going on then, I think the most sort of notable after him would be Ambedkar. So if you don't know him, he was a major figure in the Indian sort of independence movement, and particularly he was from the, you know, lower castes, from the Dalit caste. So, you know, a big part of his struggle was also fighting against the caste system, and he you know, he talked a lot about religion, you know, during his time. He explored a lot of religions, and he thought religion would be a way to sort of help could be used as a tool to fight against the caste system. You know, he saw Hinduism as not being useful for Dalits anymore. So eventually he settled on Buddhism, converted to Buddhism, and he did a lot of as close to probably heresies you can get in Buddhism. He started a form of Buddhism called Navayana. It's very hotly sort of, a lot of Buddhists with a lot of different opinions on it, but it is very interesting nonetheless. And he sort of changed a lot of the fundamentals of Buddhism to be about. So he said, you know, suffering comes about as part of class struggle rather than desire. You know, one of the Four Noble Truths. He rewrote a lot of the history of the Buddha, but I think it was Jefferson who rewrote the Bible. He did like a rational version of the Bible. So he did something similar with the Buddha's life story. Did a very sort of got rid of all the supernatural elements and told it very plainly. But yeah, I mean, you know, despite what many people might believe about him, he's, you know, probably the biggest reason that Buddhism has had its revival in India. You know, majority of the Buddhists in India are, you know, followers of Ambedkar. And he was also, you know, very much influenced by Marx as well. He wrote a very interesting piece of work called Buddha or Marx, or I think it was Karl Marx and the Buddha, which is, you know, I really recommend to everyone. Very interesting if you want to learn more about him. He did settle on Buddhism in the end, but you know, he's always been, definitely was a socialist, like many sort of the Indian nationalists were at the time. And then also interesting to note is Han Yong-un. He was a sort of big figure in the Korean independence movement, you know, during the time they were being occupied by Japan. And he definitely tried to, you know, he was very much involved in the socialist movement and tried to synthesize, you know, he saw it as very, very natural to merge the two together. So yeah, he tried to, you know, a lot of the socialists were quite critical of Buddhism at the time, but he was trying to, you know, he sent a lot of letters out saying actually, you know, ideally Buddhism, you know, and refuted a lot of what they said and said, you know, ideally, you know, if we really did enact Buddhism properly, you know, it would be socialistic. You know, it teaches, you know, non-attachment. You know, ending suffering. You know, so of course it goes hand in hand. And then Jiro Sano, I think that's how you pronounce it. Was also interesting figure in Japan. He wasn't really influenced by Marxism, but he created a sect of Buddhism which advocated for creating what you call a pure land in this world. Kind of think similar to sort of maybe like Quaker ideas of sort of heaven on, you know, building the kingdom of God on earth sort of thing, which he said would, you know, would be you know, anti-capitalist or would be socialist in some form, and would unfortunately end up being arrested and sort of tortured by the imperial government for promoting this sort of Buddhist socialism. And then also it's probably worth mentioning the Buddhist Socialist Party in Burma, who sort of created a synthesis of Buddhism and socialism. But I am hesitant to sort of really say they were sort of socialist. I think they sort of persecuted and fought a lot with the Communist Party during liberation there, and of course they are currently the ruling party in Burma. You know, and you know, the sort of result of all the issues going on there. So I think any sort of socialist ideals they may have followed, I think, don't really exist these days. And then I think finally I'd like to talk a little bit about the Dalai Lama, because His Holiness Dalai Lama, he's quite interesting to me, quite contentious amongst a lot of communists. And I think a lot of people are quite surprised when they find out, you know, when I say he's a socialist, but he has himself many times described himself as half Marxist, half Buddhist. He says that socialism is you know, Marxism is founded on good morals and ethics. He's even apparently referred to Mao Zedong as his grandfather, as like a grandfather to him. You know, they did meet, which I know is probably quite surprising. He does, however, believe that the USSR and other socialist countries were not true socialism, and you know, he sort of advocates for more of a peaceful sort of reformist method. But he does describe himself as Marxist. I'm still sort of I don't know what to think of him in terms of his political beliefs, but I think he's really interesting to sort of learn about at the moment, because you know, he's definitely, in terms of a modern day example of you know, someone who's merging Marxist and Buddhist thought. You know, he's one of the main contenders, really. So yeah, and I think in general, I mean, there's a lot of people who haven't, you know, like a lot of notable Buddhist figures who may not have been outwardly socialist, but there's definitely been many who have been critical of capitalism. You know, a lot of the, you know, in my time listening to a lot of Tibetan lamas, you know, a lot of them generally are very critical of how capitalism, you know, occurs in the West, you know, because it doesn't, you know, rely on promoting greed and mindless consumption, which are antithetical to a lot of Buddhist ideas. So I think it's quite interesting how many of them are. Obviously, not all of them, but I think Zongza, Tensei Rinpoche, for example, he's quite critical. So yeah, and then you've had figures like Thich Nhat Hanh who have been very engaged and quite, I'd say, socialistic in their approach when it's coming into the practice of Buddhism. So there's been a lot of interesting examples of Buddhism and socialism colliding in the past. So you're probably thinking, what do I think? As someone who is a socialist and a Buddhist. So I made a handy graphic. Made this a while back, and yeah, that's all I have to say really. I'm only joking. I've got actual ideas. So my own opinion is, I think fundamentally they are, they're different philosophies. Like I said earlier, Buddhism is not inherently socialistic or anything like that, because it's not really answering the same question as Marxism. Marxism is, is trying to figure out why human history is the way it is, and what's the best way of creating revolution. Buddhism is trying to answer the question about human suffering and what's the best way to reach the truth of the universe, of reality. But it's quite interesting that they kind of somehow answer the same questions, I'd say, about human suffering, but from different ends. Marxism is a materialist philosophy, so it says we must rely on the world around us and study that to if we want to end human suffering, that's how we end class struggle. Whereas Buddhism says we need to look to our ideas and inwardly. But both of them say both are just as important. So Buddhism says ideas affect the material world, and the material world affects your ideas. Marxism says the material world affects ideas, and then your ideas affect the material world. So I think there is a lot of similarity in terms of the sort of dialectical aspects of both philosophies. I think also when you're going on to sort of Mahayana philosophy, when we're talking about bodhisattvas and the bodhisattva vow, exactly, you're talking about ending other people's suffering. This idea of ending the aspect of the self and things like that, which if you're going out to end other people's suffering, to me that it just seems like obviously that would also involve ending the systems that cause suffering, ending things, inequality, poverty, imperialism, oppression. It seems to go hand in hand, and I think a lot of other Buddhists also agree. Hence why we've got an engaged Buddhist movement these days. Hence why we had people like Thich Nhat Hanh with his ideas. So I think that naturally, you would end up with some sort of socialist ideas from that. And then I'd like to just talk about engaged Buddhism. I think that also provides a good template of how Buddhism can share a lot in common with socialism. Buddhism says that it's not enough just sitting in a monastery, and this goes all the way back to the Buddha himself. The whole aspect of the community of monks is they were meant to serve the community around them, and then in return they were looked after by the community. Might not necessarily work that way across the whole world, but engaged Buddhism is definitely a sort of a revival of that. And it's saying, look, to be a good Buddhist, it's not enough to just meditate and practice mindfulness. You need to go out and help other people. You need to help, whether that is just teaching them mindfulness, or whether that's physically helping them, with providing them shelter and food and fighting against depression. I think ultimately, my own sort of view when it comes to just generally spirituality. I think capitalism just does not provide a good environment, or it actively inhibits spiritual practice. I definitely see that. I think a lot of religious organisations these days tend to suffer from this. They've lost a lot of the spiritual aspects, and tend to focus more on on the politics, or just material aspects, and they've forgotten. I think this is why a lot of people are increasingly becoming sort of atheistic in the West, because it's not really, religion is failing to answer a lot of their questions now. How can you be a spiritual person? How can you find yourself, freeing yourself from attachment to the material world, when capitalism requires us to all, it's constantly encouraging us to mindlessly spend, mindlessly exploit each other, and it's isolating us from each other. So it's not really, it's very difficult to be spiritual under capitalism. I think ultimately, might be a bit controversial to say, but I think if ideally, if you believe in a world of spiritual freedom, and where everyone is free to practice spirituality, and you want the whole of humanity to develop themselves spiritually, we need socialism. We can't have a world where people are fighting every day to access basic needs, who are constantly being exploited, and where everything is designed for profit. That's not conducive. If that's all we're focused on, we don't have time for spirituality. So that last line is because I'm very much inspired by a lot of the stories of sort of ancient India, where you had yogis, a lot of people who would just wander India, debating each other, coming up with philosophy, and would start the foundations of things like maths and science. And I see socialism as a path to creating a world where everyone, that idea of the sort of the philosopher king that Plato had. But I think all of us could be that. And I think when we live in a world without a class system, I think all that's left, and all our needs are met. All that's left is to pursue philosophy, science, to develop ourselves, and to seek knowledge. And Buddhism is just one of the many tools that could promote this, or could work in a socialist society. So yeah, so that's all I have to say for the time being. We've got quite a small group today, so I really want to have some sort of discussion. So are there any questions? Please feel free to ask. I think Ember is reading the chat at the moment.
Yeah, before we open, because I wanted to toss a question for myself before I turn off the recording.
Absolutely.
And let folks freely ask. But as you're talking, especially at the end there, about the capitalism doesn't truly give space for spirituality, it got me thinking about how spirituality is so commodified under capitalism.
Absolutely, and I think as a Buddhist, I think a lot of Buddhists really struggle with this. I've actually bought malas, prayer beads for those of you who don't know, and I've got them in the mail. I'm like, oh, this is actually not conducive. It's just meant to be worn as jewelry. I'm like, that's not the point of these things. It's actually quite offensive, really. That this something that's meant to be a spiritual aid is not even conducive to that. It's just meant to give you a sort of spiritual aesthetic. Yeah, I think there's a real issue with that, and I think a lot of really encourage religious people to, to fight against it, and, encourage, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit.
No,
so
you're
I'll
good.
let you
Well,
ask the next question.
I think like it makes me think about the commodification of yoga. It makes me think. I say that as somebody who has a certified
Yes.
yoga
Yeah.
teacher training certificate, but also like the context of like businesses that send their executives on like Buddhist retreats because like you need this to be like a
Yes.
good executive. Like it's amazing how capitalism will find a way to commodify literally anything.
I was initially, ironically, very, very against meditation. When I was dealing with depression, I had loads of people say, try meditation, and I rolled my eyes and just like, it's one of those things you get told loads. Anyone who's gone through something similar can relate. And I actually did meditation for different reasons. I did meditation because I wanted to improve like my concentration and things like that, rather than to sort of alleviate any mental illness. But yeah, the way meditation is, when you actually read Buddhist philosophy, meditation is very different. It's not just about relaxing yourself. It's a tool for knowledge, and in fact, I've had people say the opposite to me, like, if you're suffering from severe depression or anxiety, don't meditate because it can make things worse. If you're doing it properly, it can really actually make things worse, because it's not meant to be a tool about relaxing yourself or, I don't know, being better at your job or something like that. Ideally, if meditation's working in the Buddhist sense, you should be rubbish at your job. You should be quitting your job and wanting to go and live in the mountains or something like that. Oh, I don't know. You shouldn't be caring about your job. It's quite interesting actually, because there are studies now saying that people practicing meditation at work are now actually having less interest in their jobs. You're practicing mindfulness, so yeah, it's kind of shooting themselves in the foot there.
Right. Well, and I'll echo. I saw in the chat. Someone said it's life changing, and I agree. When done well, it's not always gonna make you feel better, but it'll help you be better. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and we'll wrap up our YouTube recording here. So I'm gonna hit stop on that. Thank you if you've joined us on the later recordings.